The Senate will come back to order. The Senate will come back to order. For what purpose does the senator from the 32nd rise?
Mr. President, I move that House Bill 156 be removed from the table.
Mr. Secretary, can you please read the caption?
House Bill 156 by Representative Parsons of the 44th and others, a bill to be entitled an act to amend Titles 38 and 50 of the OCGA relating to military, emergency management, and veterans affairs and state government, respectively, so as to facilitate the sharing of information and reporting of cyber attacks, to require governmental agencies and utilities to report any cyber attacks, and for other purposes. The Senate Committee on Veterans, Military, and Homeland Security recommends that this bill do pass by substitute. Respectfully submitted, Senator Kirkpatrick of the 37th. Senate Veterans, Military, and Homeland Security offers the following substitute to House Bill 156, a bill to be entitled an act to amend Title 38 of the OCGA relating to military, emergency management, and veterans affairs so as to provide for additional powers and duties related to Homeland Security and the military, to facilitate the sharing of information and reporting of cyber attacks, and for other purposes. This completes the order, Mr. President.
The senator from the 32nd has asked that House Bill 156 be removed from the table. Is there objection? The chair hears none, and it is taken off the table. The chair recognizes the senator from the 32nd to present House Bill 156.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow senators, this is an important cybersecurity bill that requires state and local governments and utilities to report any data breach that is already required to be reported to the federal government to also be reported to GEMA. This would include any breach that creates a life safety event or impacts the security of data. In committee, we added consumer protection language that makes it clear that breaches impacting consumers require notification to the consumer as already covered in our existing law. We also added language that allows the governor to enter into agreements with our military commands to enhance STEM and cybersecurity, for example, workforce and education partnerships. Mr. President, if there are no questions, I'll yield the will.
You have no questions.
Thank you, I yield.
Any other senator wish to speak for or against House Bill 156? The chair sees none. The question is on the adoption of the committee substitute. Is there objection to adoption of the committee substitute? The chair hears none, and the committee substitute is adopted. Is there objection to agreeing to the report of the committee which is favorable to the passage of the bill? The chair hears none. The report of the committee is agreed to. Is there objection to the main question being ordered? The chair hears none, and the main question is ordered. Questions on the passage of the bill by substitute. All those in favor vote yea. Opposed, nay. The secretary will unlock the machine. Have all senators voted? Oh, we still got some more coming. Lunch must have been good. Have all senators voted? We got one coming, all right? First vote after lunch, we'll take our time. Yes, sir. All right. Have all senators voted? Got a thumbs up in the hallway. Mr. Secretary, please close the machine. On the passage of the bill, the yeas are 45, the nays are 0. This bill, having received the requisite constitutional majority, is therefore passed by substitute. Chair recognizes the majority leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that we remove SB 241 from the table.
Mr. Secretary, please read the caption.
Senate Bill 241 by Senator Dugan of the 30th and others, a bill to be entitled an act to comprehensively revise elections and voting to amend Chapter 2 of Title 21 of the OCGA relating to elections and primaries generally so as to provide for the establishment of voter intimidation and illegal election activities hotline, to limit the ability of the State Election Board and the Secretary of State to enter into certain consent agreements, to amend Article 1 of Chapter 13 of Title 50 of the OCGA relating to general provisions regarding administrative procedures so as to provide for the submission and suspension of emergency rules by the State Election Board and for other purposes. The Senate Committee on Ethics recommends that this bill do pass by committee substitute. Respectfully submitted, Senator Burns of the 23rd. The Senate Committee on Ethics offers the following substitute to Senate Bill 241, a bill to be entitled an act to comprehensively revise elections and votings, to amend Chapter 2 of Title 21 of the OCGA relating to elections and primaries generally so as to provide for the establishment of voter intimidation and illegal election activities hotline, to limit the ability of the State Election Board and the Secretary of State to enter into certain consent agreements, to provide for the suspension and temporary replacement of election superintendents on the basis of malfeasance, neglect of duty, incompetence, or inability to perform duties, to provide for participation in multi-state voter registration system, to provide for the use of portable or movable polling places only under limited conditions, to revise a definition, to require reasons for absentee voting, to require identification for requesting an absentee ballot application, and to submit an absentee ballot, to provide for the processing of absentee ballot applications and absentee ballots, and for other purposes. This completes the order, Mr. President.
The Senate will stand at ease for a moment.
The senator from the 30th has moved that SB 241 be removed from the table. Is there objection? Here, speak up. There is objection. All those in favor of removing 241 from the table will vote yea. Those opposing 241 coming from the table will vote nay. Mr. Secretary, if you unlock the machines. Senator from the 36, why do you rise?
Parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Isn't it true that a no vote would put this bill where it belongs, which is on the table, and not pushing voter suppression policy?
Your statement on the parliamentary inquiry is exactly what you believe.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. Doorkeeper, are the hallways clear? Mr. Secretary, if you'd lock the machines. On the motion to remove from the table, the yeas are 32 and the nays are 18. The motion has prevailed and Senate 241 is removed from the table. Read the caption. We'll read the minority report.
Senate Ethics Committee Minority Report, March 8th, 2021. The undersigned members of the Ethics offer the following report to express our disagreement with the committee report on Senate Bill 241. We oppose eliminating no excuse mail voting and for other purposes. Respectfully submitted, Senator Butler of the 55th, Senator Harbison, Senator Harrell of the 40th, and Senator Jones of the 10th. This completes the order, Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from the 30th.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've heard a little bit about 241 over the last month or so. Some of it is actually in the bill, and some of it, what we've seen publicized, is not in the bill. What I don't want to do is leave any misconception as to what exactly is and is not part of Senate Bill 241. So I've heard a constant refrain, what problem are we trying to solve with each of these sections? So I'm going to go through section by section. I'm going to say what this section does and why we think it's important for us to have it done. Section 1 creates a hotline in the AG's office that our voters can use to report any complaints or allegations of wrongdoing. Why? During the actual conduct of the election, the Secretary of State's office already has their hands full. Creating this hotline in the AG's office relieves some of the Secretary of State's burden while also having an entity outside of that office review the complaints. I see benefit in the entity reviewing the complaints being independent from the entity that is conducting the election. Section 2. What? This is creating a new section labeled 21-2-35, but I'll also be referring back to section 21-2-31. The State Election Board was created in 1959, and the composition and responsibilities of that board have changed over the years. In 21-2-31, the duties of the State Election Board are delineated. Those duties are broad, but somewhat nebulous. Enough so that they invite multiple interpretations. Part of our responsibility here in the General Assembly is to ensure that there are continual checks and balances that define our form of government, while still allowing the state election board to ably comply with Section 6 of their responsibilities. Section 3, what? Allows the state election board, after due notice to the affected person or persons, and after the opportunity for that person or persons to appear before the state election board, and if the state election board deems that action should be taken, they will, in writing, submit to the county's legislative delegation recommending temporary removal. Within 15 days after that notification, that legislative delegation may vote by majority vote to temporarily remove and then fill that vacancy for the period of the suspension by a person or persons of their choosing. Why? There have been counties across the state, some of our deepest, bluest counties here in metro Atlanta, here recently, where the delegation had concerns about the election superintendents and boards, but had no avenue to address those concerns. This section is simply providing that avenue while still keeping the decisions under local control. Section 4. There's a multi-state voter registration system called ERIC that Georgia does participate in, but it's still a may instead of a shall. This makes that a shall. Why? ERIC has existed since 2012 and was originally made up of Colorado, Delaware, Maryland, Nevada, Utah, Virginia, and Washington. ERIC currently includes 31 states. Their mission is to assist the approving of our voter rolls and to increase access to voter registration for all eligible voters. This is too important an activity for our state to leave it as a may. It is not specifically called ERIC in the bill to provide flexibility in the future should ERIC change its name or we choose to go with another system that accomplishes the same intent. Section 5 provides clarity of purpose for mobile voting facilities. Mobile voting facilities have been legal under Georgia law since 1998. Some of the questions brought up about their legality are unfounded, but the intent for their use in 1998 was not how they were most recently used. The original intent for the mobile voting facilities was to replace existing polling locations should there be an issue with those facilities that created health or safety concerns. Those concerns for our voters are at polling locations where, and as we've talked about before, there's been growth in certain areas of our state. And if we have an area where the previous facility was unable to meet the demands of the number of voters, these mobile facilities work there as a way of releasing that stress. The wording in the 98 law was vague, and this language was inserted to provide clarity and prevent further confusion. Section 6 creates a list of reasons that allow voters to request a mail-in absentee ballot. First, some terminology for clarity. Absentee electors refers to anyone who votes on a day or manner other than in person on election day. Additionally, there are different kinds of methods for casting absentee ballots. There is mail-in absentee, early in-person absentee, and those cast under the Federal Uniform and Overseas Absentee Voting Act. For the sake of further discussion, I will call those military and overseas ballots. The military and overseas ballots are covered under federal law. The first two are regulated under state law. The different types can be confusing. For today's discussion, I will be talking about mail-in absentee ballots. As we have all been reminded recently, Georgia adopted the no-excuse absentee ballots in 2005. And yes, it was a Republican-controlled General Assembly that made that change. The number of voters that chose that method of casting their ballots remained relatively small and consistent and did not create unduly stresses on elections officials. That has changed. The increase in burden on local election offices and the increased cost to each of our counties has risen significantly. In recent years, the number of mail-in absentee ballots has increased to the point where counties are, in essence, running 3 elections simultaneously. In addition to the increased workload and increased costs, there is a third factor that may be even more important to me. Unfortunately, the highest rate of rejected ballots are those ballots that are sent in by mail. Even with our robust curing efforts, those sent by mail are still much higher than in-person voting. Listed in the bill is a broad range of valid reasons to request a mail-in absentee ballot. The opportunities to use this method still exist, but the workload, the cost, and the probability of our citizens actually having their voices count would be better if this criteria was in place. Just for example, because the question may come up. In the 2020 election, there were 1,782,580 mail-in ballot requests. There were 1,320,154 mail-in ballots accepted. Based off the excuses that are listed in this bill, there would be 2,767,418 citizens that would still be eligible for a mail-in absentee ballot. That's more than the number that requested it under the last election, which we had the highest turnout in our state's history, and more, almost twice the number that were accepted. So this is not preventing anyone from voting by a mail-in absentee. All this is doing is creating a groundwork to help relieve some of the stresses that we see in the future as we continue to grow. Section 7 is simply the process of how our voters request an absentee mail-in ballot and the information required to be submitted with that request. I've heard, so you're having to have a photo of their driver's license. That is not in this bill. A driver's license number, your voter identification number, which, and I've heard it given both ways, is free by the state and has been free by the state for the last 10 years. You should also be able to use the last 4 of your social and your birth date. So then I've heard there's 3% of the population out there that still don't have those. What are we going to do? And I would challenge everybody in the room, if and when we identify that 3%, that doesn't mean they're precluded from getting those forms of identification. That just means they don't have them right now. Let's work together to get that all 100% of those that are legally eligible to vote the tools they need to vote. Section 8 is simply the actions taken by the registrar or absentee ballot clerk when they receive a request for an absentee mail-in ballot. Both of those are about clarity in the process. Section 9 describes the process that third-party advocates use during their efforts to increase mail-in absentee ballot requests. First of all, I commend the organizations from all sides of the ideological spectrum in their efforts to get all eligible voters engaged in the elections process. And that is why we chose this route rather than routes such as states like Tennessee chose, where they just banned it. Our nation's voting history during presidential election years has traditionally been above 50%, with only 3 times having it go below that 50% threshold. In 2020, that percentage jumped to 62% of the voting age population, making it the highest average since 1960. That is a really, really good thing. And I commend voter drive efforts for making that possible. Unfortunately, some of the mailings about how to get that absentee ballot caused confusion among many of our voters who thought they were getting multiple requests from the state. All this does is require a simple notification, much like what we use in our own political mailers, to clearly identify who is doing the mailing and that it is not an official state document. The intent is to alleviate confusion amongst our citizens. Section 10 defines the term sites. This one, you hear it so often, this is a simple language cleanup. This one is a simple language cleanup. We talk about buildings and structures and throughout the code section except for this one area that says sites. All this is doing is putting that as a building so it conforms with the rest of Code Section 21. Section 11, identification verification requirements for an absentee ballot. I think most of us in this room would agree that verifying signatures is subjective at best. Signatures change over the years for a variety of reasons, and someone's vote should not be held in question because of those changes. I remember a couple of years ago when we were sitting in an ethics meeting, and my good friend from the 15th was talking about a lady that had gotten elderly. Her hand was shaking a little bit more, and her signature looked different than it did when she was much younger. My signature looks different than it did when I was 18 and registered to vote. I think most of the people in this room would say that that signature is different. And even the most sophisticated signature matching equipment only get about 60% confirmation. We don't need to do that. We don't need people who unfortunately have developed Parkinson's over the years and their hand is shaken. We don't have to worry about the caregiver that has changed, that is signing the ballot for the person they're giving that care to when they want to vote. All we're doing is putting a number on there that coincides with the person and taking the subjective signature match out of the equation and creating a more objective formula. Section 12, it does two things. It explains to voters how to cast their absentee ballot and places an obligation for a site to be used to tell people how many people have voted. Why? The explanation of how a cast-in mail-in ballot, absentee ballot is obvious during the continuation from Section 11, but the reporting directs each municipal website that they must tell you how many people have voted since 10 the next day. And I've heard there's no way each county can do that. They don't have the resources. We're increasing the burden on that. What that means is they put on their website a link to the Secretary of State's website that's already doing this. But instead of our voters having to go through find it in the Secretary of State's website on their own, they go to the board that they are most comfortable with, the one that's closest to their home, hits that link, and it gives them that information. So no, that is not an undue burden on each of our counties. Section 13 describes the curing process for ballots returned with errors, but also the scanning of mail-in ballots starting on the second Monday prior to the day of the primary, election, or runoff. Section 13 contains the same language that our chamber passed, I believe unanimously, in Senate Bill 40 earlier this session. Why? For part one, it's because we are all human and we're going to make mistakes. As much as possible, we should find ways to help those that have made a simple mistake to fix their error and have their vote count. Part two is even with the excuse requirement that we have on there, there's going to be a significant increase of the number of mail-in absentee ballots. We should allow for the counties to perform their duties in a more timely, efficient manner by having the scanning of mail-in absentee ballots begin earlier. Notice that I said scanning. There's no tallying, tabulating, or anything other than the scanning for ease in post-election result reporting. So they're not starting at 7:01 or 8:01 or whatever time period the polls close in a particular area to start feeding those into a machine to generate a vote count. They can scan them in before, and it helps speed up the process and makes it less burdensome on each county. Section 14. Allow the Secretary of State to audit information contained in the absentee ballot application or envelopes. The clerk of the Superior Courts or city clerk maintain the envelopes after elections. There's nothing that, this provision clearly states that the Secretary of State or their authorized agents are allowed to access those envelopes in case of an audit. Right now, that's not clearly defined in law. We make some assumptions. We even have thrown at times people under the bus saying, why are you not doing this? This clearly defines what the process is, and those that are holding the ballots have the ability to allow an audit and review of those envelopes or ballot applications to the designated representative of the Secretary of State's office. Section 15 authorizes a judge of the Superior Court of the county in which the precinct is located to extend poll hours upon good cause being shown. Why? Although this has been common practice in the state, it is not specifically codified in our law. So when we're doing reform, we're going through and seeing common practices that we've been doing across the state that are not on our books. Put them on the books. Section 16 says, after the time of closing the polls and the last elector voting in the precincts will report to the election superintendent the total number of votes cast and that precinct and the number of provisional ballots cast. Once the counting has begun, it will continue until all ballots have been counted or tabulated. Why? Confusion around Election Day is often a byproduct of a lack of information in the hands of our electors. For example, as the process exists now, the number of provisional ballots on hand is not presented. I feel a lot of the confusion around Election Day would be mitigated if we simply made known how many people voted early in person, how many people voted on Election Day, how many absentee mail-in ballots were received by the required time of Election Day, how many provisional ballots were cast, and how many military overseas ballots were sent out. I understand that total, the final vote total, will be less than the combined number that I just mentioned, because not all of the provisionals will be accepted, and not all of the military overseas ballots will either be returned or received within the allowable time. But it will let people know that the max number of votes that are possible during this election are at this level, and it may be lower, as opposed to, here's the vote total, oh, here's 5,000 more, here's 10,000 more. And those are the provisional ballots that are being adjudicated and accepted. Section 17 strikes the exception language on lines 737 to 741. Why? It makes this section compatible with the actions in Section 16. Section 18, purely clean up language about the notification of where the computation of votes will be held and public notification requirements so our electors will know those locations. Section 19, also clean up to make sure where actions are covered in different areas of the code section that they are all saying the same thing. What you can't have is part of one code section being contradictory to another part of the code section. Section 20 addresses ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is illegal in Georgia, but it is not really clear to our citizens exactly what that is. This is to provide clarity to better inform our citizens so they are not inadvertently breaking the law. And the question I get, can my 8-year-old daughter go with me to the ballot box or the booth and watch me do my civic duty? Yes. Your daughter can, your son can, your niece can, your nephew can, your mother can, your father-in-law can, your mother-in-law can. When you go through the list that's in the code, there's like 20 people that are allowed to see you fill out your ballot and how it's cast. This doesn't do away with that. This clearly defines what ballot harvesting is and what it's not. Section 21 reinstills some checks and balances in our government, even during times of emergency. Why? While broad powers are required during times such as the current health state of emergency we as a legislative body find ourselves in, we still have the responsibility to perform our roles. As it is written right now, we do not have that ability. This is a notification requirement and available action provision that allows us the ability to perform our duties, much like times when we are not in a healthcare crisis. We need them to have the ability to do their jobs, to get us out of this healthcare crisis as quickly as we possibly can. But we, as a body, and one of the equal parts of our government, still have a responsibility. Section 22 is the severability clause. The lawyers will explain what that means when we're done. And Section 23 is a standard closing. Mr. President, I doubt there are any questions, but there are. I'll be glad to take them.
You have questions, Senator. Recognize the senator from the 6th.
Will the senator yield?
I yield.
Senator, you indicated with respect to whether the 8-year-old would have committed a felony, and you specifically said that that provision is supposed to target ballot harvesting, correct?
I like the way you formulated the question, but what I said was it clearly defines who can and who cannot observe, who can fill out a ballot. There's provisions in there that say who's allowed now. Those are not being changed, but it gives you a greater understanding of who is not allowed to witness you filling out a ballot. Did that answer your question?
No. Isn't it true, Senator, that with respect to the code section that is cited here in terms of 409, that specifically is about an elector who is disabled or can't read and requires the assistance of someone with respect to filling out a ballot or helping them or aiding them to cast their ballot in person?
It is more than those with disabilities, but yes, that within 409, it's assisting electors who cannot read English or do have disabilities.
Correct. And that's the only reason that you can actually have someone assist you in terms of casting your ballot or filling out your ballot. Isn't that correct?
Or witnessing you do it.
Absolutely. So the 8-year-old could be adjudged guilty of a felony, correct?
I do not agree with that premise there, Senator, but I'm open to your perspective.
Well, it's not perspective, it's the words as they're written, Senator. Specifically, you indicated also, will the senator yield?
I will.
You indicated that with respect to the application, that you could just give the last 4 of your social if you didn't have a driver's license or the Georgia identification card that's issued by DDS. Is that right?
With your birth date, yes.
Okay. But isn't it true with respect to your bill, there isn't any indication that you can use your social with respect to actually applying for an absentee ballot?
Senator, with our conversations with the Secretary of State's office, but after this was done as a substitute, that is one of the acceptable forms that I'm sure when we get over to the House, there will be a slight modification. But yes, that is the intent, that you use the last 4 and the birth date.
So it's actually not in the bill right now?
It is not in the bill right now.
Okay. Will the senator yield?
Please.
In terms of signature match, you indicated that it's one of the most subjective ways. Can't remember exactly what your words were. I wrote them down. That it's just subject to subjectivity, and that's why
It is more subjective than using numbers, yes.
In terms of that, but isn't there a signature match requirement still in your bill with respect to casting of the ballot?
With the signature of your oath, there is. There is a signature requirement that says that with the oath that goes along with you casting your ballot, that is still in there. So I'm not saying that there's not a value in signature. I'm just saying it is not the most complete way to authenticate the identity of a person. So you would go with that and say, if this person has this other pertinent information that is not subjective, and then has a signature that's a swearing or affirmation, that you can go by the totality of the subjective and the objective being together, and say without a reasonable doubt that that is this person.
So it is not correct to say that there isn't a signature match with respect to this bill.
It is correct to say that the signature is not the preeminent measure of determining whether that is the person that has submitted that ballot.
Will the senator yield?
Sure.
With respect to the application, you've indicated that it is to actually identify the voter, the elector, to make sure that they are properly qualified, correct?
No, it's to ensure that the integrity of that ballot is taken to the point where you go, this, beyond anybody's reasonable doubt, is this person. So yes, it's a two-part. It's that is the person, and on the other side is there's no question from anybody else that that is the person who's sending in that ballot. So there's no uncertainty there. There have been times since within the last little bit where people have intentionally modified their signature when mailing in for an absentee mail-in, and they were allowed to go. Now, fortunately, those were those people, but there's no way that a person can sit there and go, I can look at this signature and this other signature and say without a reasonable doubt that these two are the same individual.
Will the senator yield?
Senator, I will yield for one more question from you unless you're the spokesman for your caucus, because I'm at 28 minutes and 11 seconds.
Well, I just want to make sure that with respect to that even if the registrar does know who it is and has that information, that if that oath isn't signed or if the application is not complete, that ballot won't be sent out.
Senator, just as an example, in my voting precinct, when I go in, and I understand you're talking about a specific type here, but when I go in, they go, hey, Mike, how you doing? Good to see you. Can I see your ID? Even though they know who I am because I grew up in that community and they have known me my entire life, there's still requirements that they have to verify the identity of the person that's coming by the rules in which we lay out. So if you like the subjective only method, I can see that, but I would rather have some objectivity in it as well. Thank you. Mr. President?
Yes, Senator. You have
I yield.
Recognize the
I've
senator.
got 30 seconds left.
you got 30 seconds left. Senator from 42nd. He has yielded well. He's out of time. Time has expired. Does any other senator wish to speak for or against the measure? State your inquiry.
Mr. President, given the nature of this legislation that's been proposed and the impact that it would have on Georgia and all of our elections, do you feel it's prudent to give the senator more time in the well so that he can answer some of the questions? There's a lot of members from our caucus that have questions that really need to be answered.
The senator from the 22nd has his button mashed to press to speak, so I'll call upon the senator from the 22nd. Senator from the 22nd, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will be addressing SB 241, and some remarks to some extent will also go into the other bills, although not by name. They're all somewhat similar because the fact that I don't want me coming up here consistently throughout the day on these particular bills. One of the reasons, of course, why we're here, why all of these bills, even 241, even though we've heard about it being about cost as far as eliminating no excuse absentee balloting, and a clarification on the rolling polling precincts to clarify how they can actually be used, because we know they were used this time as actually a rolling polling precinct, which is exactly what it sounds. And so my comments would basically focus on those two areas, as far as eliminating no excuse absentee balloting, and also basically clarifying in a way that unnecessarily limits the rolling polling precincts and why it is an issue. When we start talking about why we're really here today, I would argue that we're not about cost, but we've been brought here, of course, because of allegations and things of that nature, what we call election fraud. And so when I wanted to know about that, I wanted to go to a place where I could trust. And so I was like, well, I want everybody to be able to trust it. So I went to the Heritage Foundation, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, and found some preambles that they discussed before they talked about specific instances of election fraud. And they said a couple of great things. And one of the things they said was that this election fraud deprives persons of the right to vote in a free and fair election, and free and fair elections is the most basic civil right, one of which many other rights of the American people depend. Congress and the state should guarantee that every eligible individual is able to vote, and that no one's vote is diluted, and that preserving the great experiment that is the American Republic is dependent upon fair and free elections. When selecting a city councilor or the President of the United States, every American must be able to trust the process and the results to ensure our democratic freedoms. All very true words, without a doubt. And we'll come back to those. But I've looked further in this particular document, which is one that many conservatives and Republicans are familiar with this group. And they talk about what quote-unquote voter fraud is. It's impersonation, it's duplication of votes, fraudulent use of absentee ballots, vote buying, illegal assistance at the polls, among others. And so therefore I asked, well, what would basically eliminating no excuse absentee voting, or further clarifying rolling polling precincts, limiting their use, have to do with any of those things? Whether you're talking about impersonation or duplication of voting, fraudulent use of absentee, or vote buying, does not address any of that. And that's what we heard all through December, that elections were stolen. And so part of the reason why we're here for 241 is to address those issues, even though today is being couched as just to save the county costs, which will also be important. Now, in the Heritage Foundation, they say that liberals, like myself, I guess, will say that election fraud is inconsequential when you compare it to the majority of the votes. And they pound the table, so to speak, and talk about how even one vote, if it's done incorrectly, is wrong. And I'm sure most of the persons in this room would agree with that and say, if one vote was done through quote-unquote election fraud, then therefore we have to change the whole system. Just one vote, maybe 10 or 12. And so when we look at rolling polling places or ending no excuse voting, it was mentioned that the no excuse absentee balloting went into effect in 2005, actually went into effect by a Columbia County politician. She led it in the House and passed it. And quite frankly, it was passed, and many Democrats said it slipped under the radar. And some persons even had opposition to it. But the bottom line was, from 2006, where the members of the majority party won statewide, in 2008, the same, 2010, the same, 2012, the same, 2016, the same, 2018, the same, no changes to eliminating or changing no excuse absentee balloting. None. 2006 it worked, 2008, 10, 12, 16, and 18. No changes were suggested. But then in 2020, when we have members of the Democratic Party win on a statewide basis, not the House or the state Senate, mind you, but on a statewide basis now, although we're dealing with a pandemic, and we dealt with somebody from their own party who told their own voters not to go vote, now we're suggested that we need to change no excuse absentee balloting, and say, well, it's too much on the counties. Well, we should recognize that, number one, we were dealing with a pandemic, so possibly this is an outlier. And then number two, we should also recognize that if this is going to be a new way of voting, then we need to figure out how to make sure we continue to expand the franchise, not to try to limit it. And we hear, well, it'll broaden it out. It'll be more numbers potentially that can take advantage of it than actually used it. But we're still restricting. But remember, we said that one vote, if it's done, if we lose one vote through fraud, it's too much. That's very interesting. We'll come back to that. But I continue to look on this Heritage Foundation website, one that I trust, and I'm sure members of the majority party do too. And they actually labeled fraud in Georgia. They went through it. And I said, well, here we go. We're going to find it out now. All this fraud is going to be shown. There were 7 criminal convictions in Georgia since 1997 for quote-unquote election fraud. 4 of those dealt with one particular case, where it was just one group of persons who were actually trying to do vote buying. The other 3 dealt with persons actually just not saying that they were helping persons actually fill out their ballot. Since 1997, there were actually other civil actions that took place, only a total of 20, none of which cost anyone in the election, none of which had any impact. 2 of those where a person did not clarify that they had assisted someone, and 2 actually were persons who actually tried to register twice. That was it since 1997. And this is according to the Heritage Foundation. So all of the anecdotal stories that we're going to hear probably, all the election fraud, I guess it exists. Since 1997, that's it, according to the most conservative organization in the United States. But we'll hear that that's too much. That even just losing those votes, and even if it didn't cost the election, is too much. And even since for 21 years, average less than one case a year is too much. Interesting. Because I would then say that do we look at it the same way when we restrict the vote? How many persons and how many votes do we lose when persons have to sit in a long line? How could not restricting rolling precincts affect that? How many votes or how many persons do we lose when polling places are closed? How does restricting our rolling polling places or restricting the fact that you can do no excuse absentee balloting affect that? How many votes are you lost there? And I think it's important to actually look at what the facts say, because according to ProPublica, 2/3 of the polling locations that stayed late in Georgia, over 51 minutes, occurred in African-American neighborhoods. 1/2 of all voters reside in Fulton County, Gwinnett, Forsyth, DeKalb, Cobb, Hall, Cherokee, Henry, and Clayton, many of those predominantly African-American, but only 38% of polling places reside there. Could not rolling polling places, could not continue to expand no excuse voting help with that? If our concern is just one vote could be lost, then we ought to be saying if one vote could be lost, then God dog it, we ought to be trying to make sure that we expand the franchise as much as we possibly can, not restrict it, not just because of cost. According to Stanford University political scientists, it says that the majority of all polling places that stayed open after 7 p.m. were in African-American precincts by a total of 51 minutes. In non-African-American precincts, it was only 6 minutes if it opened past 7 p.m. How many people didn't stand in that line? How many votes were lost? See, we're asking it the wrong way, because if we're concerned about losing votes, then we should be saying, how do we deter that? We can do that by either opening more polling places. We can do that by continuing rolling polling places. We can do that by expanding no excuse absentee balloting, not restricting it. That's how we could accomplish that. In June 2020, Georgia voters had 331 fewer polling places than in November 2012, a 13% reduction in polling places, most occurring in African-American precincts. How do we address that? as we pound the table and say that one vote lost through voter fraud, which doesn't exist, one vote loss is too much, and therefore we must change the whole system. But when we talk about changing the whole system, we won't change it to expand, we change it to restrict. Last year, this body, although the timing was incorrect, in SB 463 tried to address the issue of polling places, passed out. But it went to the House, and the House stripped it. And what did they do? They said that the Secretary of State can't send out absentee applications. So here we were trying to deal with that particular issue. And what did the House do? They said, we don't care about opening polling places longer. We just want to make sure the Secretary of State doesn't send out absentee applications. Once again, attempting to restrict the franchise. And so therefore, when we talk about this, that is the backdrop that we have. And if we're serious about expanding the franchise, if it's really about that, if we're serious about that, then we're going to have an opportunity to do that. We're going to have a huge opportunity to do that. When HB, 531 comes over here, if we're not about restricting the franchise, when HB 531 comes over here, I challenge this body to make sure that we amend it and put on SB 39, which allows nonviolent felons to vote. We just passed a bill that will allow those persons to get licenses, compete for license against persons who never committed a crime. And we all patted ourselves on the back about that. Persons who never committed a crime now will compete against persons who have committed a crime of moral turpitude. Interesting. But those same felons that we are now saying you can compete against our fellow citizens for jobs, if we're serious, we'll allow them to vote. But we're not serious about actually expanding the franchise. It's okay to go out and work and get money for us and pay your taxes, but you're not going to get the right to vote. So that's the opportunity. If you want to prove to this body that you want to expand the franchise, when 531 comes over here, we got the chance. And 39's been vetted. We had a strong study committee that vetted it all the way out and found out that nonviolent felons, they don't have any particular party. It basically is party neutral. So as many of my colleagues come up and they talk about the fact that we're restricting the franchise through these bills, we're going to have an opportunity to prove them wrong. We're going to have an opportunity to show, no, we actually want to expand it. The same way we got our fellow citizens competing against persons who have felons or felonies on their record, not even nonviolent, as a matter of fact, to get working licenses, we want them persons to be able to vote. We'll find out where that debate goes. But lastly, let's look back at the words of the Heritage Foundation, where they talk about the fact that voting is the pillars of our democracy, that the right to vote is the most basic civil right, one of which many rights of the American people depend, and there could be no truer statement. And therefore, I would say this. As persons come up, many of my colleagues come up, you will hear many of them, I'm sure, become emotional and possibly their voice will crack. It's because that most basic right was denied to us. It's not in the 1800s, it's not 1850s. It's right here in this room. Many of the senators that sit here lived through that process. I see that every day with my parents. We live that. We understand how that most basic right was denied. Let me tell you, it is not theater. It is not a performance. It is real because we live with it every single day. So when we say that this has a unique impact on us, our voice should be heard louder than anyone else's, because everyone else is just talking about the franchise. Everyone else is just talking about what it means to vote. No one else has had it through state law and federal law, that right deprived of them because of the color of their skin. So when we come up here and say that this matters, listen to us. Listen to us and say, well, maybe if that group says it, it means something more than what I think it means. And I can't hide behind cost and efficiency. Let's find ways to make sure we better the cost and we better the efficiency. Because this person who looks at someone every day who couldn't vote till they were 40 years old, is telling me that this has a negative impact, and maybe I should listen to them. With that, Mr. President, I'll yield for any questions.
You do have questions, Senator.
Thank you.
Call upon the senator from the 10th, who is
Go home.
out of the room. Call upon the senator from the 23rd.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the senator yield?
Yes.
Is it not true, Senator, that the senator from the 22nd serves on the Ethics Committee that considered SB 241?
That's correct.
Is it not also true, Senator, will the senator further yield?
Yes.
Is it also not true, Senator, that the Senate received the minority report today that suggests that the minority position is that we preserve no excuse absentee balloting?
That's correct. Preserve it, correct.
Preserve it, correct. Now, is it not true, Senator, that the senator from the 17th offered an amendment in committee that would strike Section 6, which would, in fact, preserve no excuse absentee balloting?
That is correct.
Thank you, Senator. One final question. Senator, is it not true that the senator from the 22nd, the 55th, and others chose not to second that motion and thereby allowed that amendment to die for lack of a second?
That is absolutely correct, because
Thank
we
you
were
very
hoping.
much. I have no further questions.
Well, I also had the opportunity to respond. Our position on that was on all of those election bills that we weren't going to necessarily try to second those, and we should try to do any perfection on the floor, which of course was prevented. That was our position. And of course, that was all these bills were engrossed. So that's where we were on that particular issue. So I understand exactly where the senator was coming from. Should have addressed that in my remarks, but that's exactly what the position was. And the fact of the matter is, these are your bills. These election bills are completely unnecessary. They don't need to be going forward. And if this particular party wanted to change that, then this particular party could do that at any moment.
One final question, Senator, if you'll yield.
Yes.
With your comments, I accept those, but the reality is that no member of the committee chose to second an amendment to Senate Bill 241 that would have preserved no excuse absentee balloting. Thank you.
I'm not really sure what the senator is stating, but I understand.
My question is that not true? That no senator on the committee seconded?
That's
the
correct, and I
amendment?
explained that. I explained
Thank
our
you.
situation. That's absolutely correct. And I'll yield for any other questions, Mr. President.
There are no other questions, Senator.
Thank you.
Recognize the senator from the 6th. Speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I think we should all want to ensure that all voters have full, meaningful access to the fundamental right, because really it preserves all others, right? The right to access the ballot and elect candidates of our choice. I mean, we should all want that, and we should be trying to pass measures or support measures that support that. SB 241 creates unnecessary barriers and burdens on voters, and it disproportionately impacts racial minorities, the elderly, those that live in rural Georgia, disabled, and students. You know, and the motivations are really suspect because it's introduced immediately after voters of color dramatically increased their use of absentee voting this past year. There's been no evidence that our elections aren't secure. There's been no evidence that any of these things are fixes that are actually needed. But I think for me, the most disappointing thing has been that the process has not been very open, transparent, or inclusive. 7 a.m. subcommittee meetings not available for public viewing. And then after the subcommittees hear evidence or testimony, then it goes to the big committee, and then any kind of hearing on a lot of these bills basically is shut down. The changing of the bills kind of on an ongoing basis, specifically 241, there would be an amendment, there wouldn't. You'll get a draft, you won't get a draft, maybe you'll see it, maybe you won't. That is not how we are supposed to approach the legislative process, especially when we're talking about a bill that, as the majority leader has said, will impact the lives of 11 million Georgians. Especially a bill that we know we haven't had significant changes in our election laws since 2005. And here we are, the omnibus bill that I can go section by section and tell you exactly what's wrong with it. Yeah, 8-year-old can be a felon, right? Yeah, it's one of those things where, with respect to the sponsor of the bill, he would talk about the various, what each section meant. But then if you looked at a lot of the words, it really didn't say that. And then in response, it's, well, maybe, across the way we can fix it. That's sloppy, y'all. Especially when you're talking about a bill that's going to impact people's lives, that's going to impact the fundamental right to vote. Actually, it's pretty shameful. I'm going to let the other members of my caucus speak because they're going to do it a lot more eloquently than I can. But I can tell you that this process has not been good, it has not been transparent, and it's really a little bit shameful. So if I don't have any questions, I'll yield the well, but I'm happy to take questions as well.
You do have questions. Senator from the 41st is recognized for a question.
Senator, do you yield?
Yes.
With respect to some of the problems in this bill, maybe you can provide some light for me. On line 79, it says that the superintendent of a county or governing authority of a municipality shall be responsible for procuring and providing portable rolling polls. Is it true that every county, all 159 counties, would now have to buy a rolling poll in order to fit into this statute?
Senator, it seems that way from the language. We've taken it from a discretionary kind of thing where the counties can make a decision in terms of how they're going to deal with this, to saying that they shall be responsible for procuring and providing these portable voting places. So yeah, you're right.
Do you further yield?
Yes.
So if my county, let's say one of the precincts has a power outage and we don't have a rolling poll available to go to that location, would my county be open to a lawsuit?
Possibly, but I think what this highlights is that this language really wasn't vetted by many in this room, and definitely not by the people who actually know how to run elections.
Do you further yield?
Sure.
So when it gets to section 6 and it talks about who can be an absentee elector, the language here is because of a physical disability. So Senator, if I had a non-physical disability, say I had agoraphobia, is there any provision in this bill that would allow me to vote absentee?
No, and because of, as the senator knows, previously it was disability, because the whole idea is you don't want to run afoul of the Americans with the Disability Act. By limiting it to physical disability, you've basically rendered this clause probably unlawful under federal law.
And do you further yield?
Yes.
On line 120 in this bill, where it talks about employment, that if you are at work during the entire time that the polls are open, you can be excused, but only if that place of employment is within the precinct in which one resides. Senator, isn't it true that precincts in the metro Atlanta area are quite small?
They are, and there really isn't any kind of rational reason why you would say that you limit it to kind of a precinct area in terms of while you're working. So, but I think you're just pointing out what we know. A lot of these things are unwieldy, they're unenforceable, they're not informed in terms of the way Georgia actually runs their elections. And I think they're going to be incredibly problematic in terms of anyone trying to enforce them.
One last question, if you would yield.
Sure.
So, Senator, if I was a first responder and I was working to preserve the safety and welfare and well-being of this state, and I was serving in that capacity outside of my precinct on the day of the election, would I be allowed to vote absentee?
No, you wouldn't.
I am. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield the well.
The senator has yielded the well. Call upon the senator from the 42nd to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition to Senate Bill 241. America is at a turning point right now. Our democracy is in peril, and our society is divided along increasingly deep partisan lines. We face a choice. Are we willing to risk our own power or that of our party in order to preserve and defend our republic? The foundation for each and every one of the restrictive voting bills that have been introduced this session is a lie. The bills on the floor today are the product of the big lie, seeded, nourished, and repeated by the former president, Donald Trump, that he, not President Joe Biden, was the true winner of the 2020 election. Trump knew that more Democrats than Republicans would vote by absentee ballot because of the pandemic, and months before the election, he cynically and callously set the stage to claim he was the true winner by discouraging the use of absentee voting by mail and calling it into question. The health of American democracy, even the survival of American democracy, merited not even fleeting consideration from a man whose narcissism doesn't allow for recognition of benefit beyond his own self-interest. Regrettably, this big lie of Trump's was propped up by thousands of smaller lies told by Republicans, including some members of this body, who use their positions of authority to lend credence to Trump's lies, each one as poisonous and inaccurate as the one that came before it. There was no widespread fraud in Georgia's recent elections. 3 recounts, including a hand recount, demonstrated that definitively. But is there a loss of faith in Georgia's elections process? If so, this loss of faith is itself a response to the organized campaign of misinformation and falsehoods about our electoral processes. This loss of faith is actually a symptom of a deeper affliction. The deeper affliction is the current tendency of the members of the two parties to not just disagree, but to inhabit entirely separate realities. This is truly where our society is going awry, where the partisan divide grows into discord and even violence, and threatens the very survival of democracy in the United States. Disagreement is both acceptable and healthy in a democratic society. Citizens and elected officials alike can and should propose different solutions to our problems, but we must operate in a shared framework. We must be able to agree that the sky is blue and that oceans contain water. Knowledge is built on trusted sources, not personal knowledge or individual verification. We don't personally verify each day that the earth is round, that the temperature outside is 50 degrees, or that a hurricane is forming in the Gulf of Mexico. Rather, we accept this information as fact because we have decided to trust the scientists and satellites that deliver it to us. But today, there are a large percentage of Republican voters who are completely detached from reality and don't seem to have a workable framework to separate fact from fiction with regard to this election but other things too. It has been decades in the making, but we have reached the point where a sizable and unfortunate percentage of Republican voters don't trust science, they don't trust the media, they don't trust experts, and they don't trust the government. Instead, Facebook, YouTube, 4chan, Twitter, and random websites are seen as credible sources of news. They are not. When you don't trust science, the media, or government, you have eliminated as sources of information all institutions that have formed the basis for a shared reality of a society in all enlightened societies. This did not begin with Donald Trump, but he made it worse. For those individuals, and believe me, I get the emails, and I feel sorry for these people. They send me these websites. They seem to have no idea that none of that is true. And when I try to tell them, they send me back other false, not credible, not media, not peer-reviewed, and there is like no penetrating. And that is a threat to democracy and a threat to our country when a huge percentage of Americans no longer have a workable framework to discern truth from reality and fact from fiction. And this allowed Trump's lies to become all the more powerful to the point where millions of Americans became radicalized against their own government, to where we had an armed insurrection with the aim to prevent the US government from carrying out the peaceful transfer of power. January 6th puts in stark relief the threat to our country that comes from undermining trust in institutions for political gain. This is a problem that we all face because we are all in this democratic experiment together. But we are not all equally positioned to help solve it. The people who believe Trump's lies will not regain trust in the system until someone they trust tells them the truth. Republicans, your voters trust you. You are a trusted authority, and each of you can and must rise to the occasion and speak the truth. To have any credibility as leaders at all, we must agree that the future and survival of our democracy matters infinitely more than our own political power. Those who cast a yes vote on SB 241 are adding another tear to the fabric of American democracy. This is weaponization of Trump's lies, and it is a willingness and embrace of damage to American democracy. We face that choice. Are we willing to risk our own power or that of our party in order to preserve and defend our republic? If we call ourselves leaders, the answer should be an unequivocal yes. That is the best reason to reject Senate Bill 241. But if you need more reasons, please take heed of the fact that it will not work. Voters see through transparent attempts to cling to power through suppressive and anti-democratic means, and it makes them that much more determined to vote. Voting is about self-determination. If you try to quell the human spirit, it will not work. You can never stop the human drive for self-determination. Have you each paused any time over the past 3 months to consider the fact that members of our body lived through Jim Crow? That members of this chamber were born in a state where they couldn't vote? If you don't believe me, recall that the Voting Rights Act was not signed into law until 1965. The spirit of Black Americans has endured, prospered, and shone as a beacon of freedom and perseverance over centuries of past oppression in the United States. It won't be extinguished, And it certainly won't be dimmed by craven weaponization of Trump's lies. The only way to gain and retain power is to win people over with the power of your ideas. The numbers to stop this bill may not be here in this chamber today, but I assure you there are many thousands of Georgians right now whose political spirit is awakened by disgust at modern-day voter suppression. Ultimately, it will be those Georgians who will defeat this legislation. Mr. President, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Call upon the senator from the 10th for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the senator yield?
Yes, I do, my friend.
Senator, I appreciate your passion, and I share it as well, by the way, but there's some language in Senate Bill 241 that some of us can find particularly offensive. And I just want to know if you share the same sentiment as I do. For example, on page 2, starting on line 27, where it says basically that the Attorney General is operating a hotline. Can you understand or give any your opinion about how that would make people of color feel, knowing that the Attorney General now has a hotline and anyone can file a complaint with this Attorney General, and then that office would be investigating that complaint? Can you just explain how that would
Senator,
make
I think
some
you
of us
raise a really, really good point, because it does, as you say here, that there would be anonymous tips about election fraud. People that have been unfairly, unjustifiably sort of persecuted under laws, of course, have that level of nervousness that the same could happen to them again. And I think you make an excellent point. While I'm talking about that provision, another problem with it is that the Secretary of State already is permitted to accept complaints about the election, and does, so it's totally unclear how the jurisdiction will be divided, as well as, cost and division of labor, and confusion aspects of that particular provision.
Thank you. Would the senator further yield?
Yes, sir.
Senator, over on page 3 of this legislation, starting on line 47, it basically says the state election office may recommend in writing to the legislative delegation. I'm focused on the word may instead of shall. When a word may is inserted, does that necessarily imply that the Secretary of State has to comply with what's in here? Or does it just leave it up to his discretion or her discretion?
It would seem, Senator, that there could be some discretion. How that interplays with some other bills that have passed or may still be coming is something that I'm slightly confused about. But, it really is concerning, this notion, as you know, of course, as the chair of the DeKalb delegation, we have legislation on the books as to how our elections board is appointed. So I can't ascertain, does this overrule all of our local legislation? And on top of that, I think there's an open question as to that. And then on top of that, I find it quite curious that, the members of any legislative delegation would then be the ones tasked with appointing people to run the elections, when it's very clear from all the discussions we've had over the past 3 months that members of this body are not the preeminent experts on election processes, and that frankly others are in a far better position to recommend such an individual if that were indeed, which I'm not agreeing that it is necessary.
And I certainly agree with you, Senator. Senator Year, for
Certainly.
another question. The author of this legislation, the senator from the 30th, said there were problems that it was seeking to resolve with this legislation. I'm assuming he was talking about problems in our election systems. Given the most recent election, has there been any word from Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor's office, the Governor's office about fraud found in our most recent election?
Senator,
To an extent that would merit some kind of investigation?
Senator, no, there has not been. And in addition to the governor, who's a Republican, Secretary of State, Republican, Gabriel Sterling, Republican-appointed members of the State Elections Board, not to mention, it's something like dozens of judges around the country, the United States Attorney General, at least 2 decisions out of the United States Supreme Court. None have found any credence to Trump's lies.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. President, if there's, I could take another one, but I want to be.
No further questions,
Thank you.
Senator.
I'll yield the floor.
Call upon the senator from the 28th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of this body. Our decisions, the laws we pass, carry the weight of authority, but only when it's with the consent of the governed. And that consent is only given when the people have faith that an election was fair and fairly won. Our government's legitimacy and moral right to use state power is only justified and lawful when consented to by the people or society over which that power is exercised. When an election result is not believed, when people think results could have been tampered with, the people can lose faith in their government, and if they do, then the consent to be governed is withdrawn, and we have failed on the promise of the foundation of our country. I have seen, as no doubt all of you have, the people's concerns, our constituents' concerns about our elections. I want them to know that I heard their voice. I want to make sure all of you have heard it too. Some of you may think it's sour grapes or whining over the results of the last election. You may think some of the claims are specious. You might just think they are wrong. But I'm not up here opposing this legislation to fit anyone's narrative. I've done my own homework, and what I've learned is deeply troubling. So even if you think that the machines can't be hacked, that all the votes fairly counted, we still need the people of Georgia to believe in the process. And right now, they are unconvinced. And I just heard the senator here from the 42nd basically saying I'm a liar because I believe in that. And I can go back home and I can give this same speech and probably get a standing ovation in many rooms that I walk into. But I can't claim this speech. I didn't write it. The senator from the 42nd gave that speech word for word right here in this well. It'll be 2 years on Saturday. On March 13th, 2019, the senator from the 42nd came down word for word and gave that speech. So this didn't start today. This didn't start since November 3rd. I've said these words. And I was told I was inciting violence when I said it. And it's interesting that I just heard the senator from the 42nd come down here and talk about two realities. Because you are certainly living in two realities when you can say what you said today and you said the exact opposite 2 years ago. Go back and watch the speech, because I did. And that is exactly what she said, word for word. I delivered it word for word what she said. This bill is about reviewing a process that we saw flaws. That is what it is about. We answered the call of the minority leader from 2019. He said the process, I think, should be reviewed because the one thing we should hold most dear is the security of Georgia voters. The security of Georgia voters. The minority leader called for this 2 years ago. My only regret is it took us this long to answer that call. I'll leave you with one final quote from 2019, March 13th. But senators, trust in our electoral system is the bedrock of our democracy. Without trust, democracy fails. Senator from the 40th, thank you for that one. I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. I call upon the senator from the 48th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, colleagues. So today I want to talk about problem solving. Because before first diving immediately into solutions, I customarily like to first frame the problem that we're trying to solve. So the problem I'd like to talk about today is, why do some eligible voters not vote? Right? Nearly everyone here in this room has run for office, right? So all of us have had to grapple with this question: what prevents my voters from turning out on election day? So one primary reason is that voting comes at a cost, right? It's not always an overtly financial cost, but we shouldn't pretend it's not a cost all the same. Because voting is an investment of time, often translating into time away from paid work and obligation. Election day is, after all, on a Tuesday, and the fewer off-work hours that are available to vote early in person, the harder it is for working-class voters to carve out that time. This costs them. Voting in person often requires transportation to a polling place, which in turn requires resources and access, regardless of the method. So you might need access to a car or public transportation, or call an Uber or a Lyft, or even have enough time and energy to walk. Each of these solutions comes at a cost. Voting in many states requires access to specialized documentation or IDs, which, even if technically free, right, must be obtained at these same non-monetary but still significant costs: time, transportation, organization, technology. So I want to point out this one thing just to drive this point home. Let me see if I can get it out of my pocket. All right, hold on. You'll forgive me for covering this. So this is my driver's license. Okay, I'm covering it up because we know that there's a lot of cameras in this room, and this type of information can be often abused for identity theft. But anyway, I just want to point out that on my driver's license, my name is written here as Michelle Xiao Ao. But Xiao is not my middle name. My middle name is Xiao Yu. That's what's on my birth certificate. It is a Chinese name. And the reason that my middle name is improperly transcribed on the identification I use is that the DMV would not enter a hyphenated middle name into the field for my card. And this happens all the time, right? It continues to happen when I have to register my kids for things. They also have Chinese middle names. When we have to buy plane tickets, they also have transliterated, anglicized middle names, and our names almost never match our IDs. These are the types of issues that so many immigrant, new American, and first and second generation citizens face in navigating our voting system. Language barriers, cultural barriers, economic barriers. Certain groups simply have to bear more cost when it comes to accessing the ballot box, even when access should be equal. So once we've determined what our problems are, we next have to determine our endpoints. What are our goals? So our goal, I think, and I think you think also, should be ensuring that every eligible legal voter is able to vote at a negligible cost. I think we can agree with that. So we have our problem, we have our goal. How do we get from point A to point B? So what I would suggest, what many of us would suggest, are expanded voting hours, including on weekends. I would suggest the ability for all eligible voters to vote by mail if they choose to. I would suggest expanded access to secure 24-hour accessible absentee ballot drop boxes. And I would suggest an increased number of voting locations, including mobile voting locations, for densely populated areas or underserved areas where people have to travel very far to access the ballot box. In-language outreach and increased accessibility to voters for whom English is not their first language. and reasonable allowances for confirming voter identification. This is especially important in a district like mine, which is District 48, which has an extremely high percentage of AAPI voters who turned out in record numbers this election. But these aren't just my solutions. I didn't just come up with them, because not so long ago, they were your solutions, right? And they were good ones. They worked. More voters legally engaged in the system at negligible cost, and that's something we should be proud of. You should be proud. We did a good job this last election. So let's just talk for a second about voter confidence, which this bill aims to address. A little bit of a talk about this, right? Voter confidence. So supporters of this bill point to a lack of confidence in the state's electoral system this last election. Before we get too far, let's just stop and consider for a moment, before we go dealing with this issue, what has undermined that confidence in the first place? In other words, if you walk into a crowded movie theater and they're watching, you know, Wonder Woman, whatever movie is there, and you shout fire, right? You don't get to point to the crowd's reaction as proof that there must be something dangerous going on, because why else would everyone be running? We don't write laws based on gut reactions. We do not write laws in response to feelings or suspicions. We write laws to solve real problems and to represent the people that we serve. So as we go through this list of bills today, including this one, let's make an effort up top when we present them to frame the issues in this way. Define the real-life problems we're aiming to solve, give real-life examples, not conjecture, real examples of how this problem has manifested in the state of Georgia, and honestly define the goals that we are trying to achieve here as a group. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Call upon the senator from the 39th. Speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you all know, this is my first legislative session, and I expected, maybe naively so, that we would concentrate on the most pressing issues facing Georgians. I love our state, but I don't love that we rank 34th in education and just slipped to 46th in our healthcare systems. We have the worst maternal mortality rates in the country, and our rural Georgians don't even have reliable access to Wi-Fi. But what are we spending our time on? Bills like SB 241 that have the net effect of making voting harder and more restrictive. Georgia already has the longest lines to vote of any state. Does this bill tackle that? Nope. Instead, you're looking to take away no-excuse absentee balloting, limiting ballot drop box locations, and reducing the number of early voting days. Combined, these will make our lines even longer. Not in Buckhead, maybe, but most definitely in Bankhead. And, oh, by the way, why should any registered voter need the state's permission to vote absentee? Many of these provisions are undoing legislation that the Republican majority fought for not so very long ago, like automatic voter registration. None of these bills, this one included, solve actual problems, as our most recent election has been proven through audits and the court system to have been secure. There certainly is no emergency that necessitated we spend so much time on voting bills. We are public servants. It is our job to mind the House and put in place good public policies. And if I can put my mom voice on for a minute, this bill amounts to walking into your house, seeing a sink full of dirty dishes, loads of laundry to be done, a lawn to be mowed, a refrigerator that's empty, and deciding that instead of getting to any of that, you're going to go to the hardware store and start building a deck you don't need. We are here in the people's house. Instead of focusing our time and attention on things like the healthcare crisis that is literally right in front of our nose, We are wasting time on voting bills that do not solve a problem and are certainly not an emergency. Bills that will be challenged in court where many, dare I say most, of these provisions will be tossed out, all at the taxpayer's expense. Businesses looking to relocate to Georgia are going to notice that we are not educating our future workforce, that they will have to subsidize health care because our systems are dysfunctional and inequitable. And you know what? Maybe then y'all will come back inside and deal with the mess. The house is on fire, and you all are building a deck. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the well.
Senator from the 36th is recognized to speak to the bill.
I believe it when I see it. Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, glad to see there's still some members of the GOP on the floor as we have this bill debated. A monumental bill, a bill that speaks volumes. And it's not an attractive message that's being sent to Georgians all across this state. Other colleagues have referred to the history of our nation around voting and how the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy. And there are those who have experienced that all too fully. That is, all those who have been blocked from the ballot by legal means at the time or illegal means, whatever it took. A policeman's billy club, if it took that. Danville, Virginia, back when I was in college, they clubbed people to the ground when they marched downtown to try to vote. Danville, Virginia. And I was humbled to walk with those marchers in the '63 March for Jobs and Freedom led by Dr. King and an array of civil rights luminaries, including our own John Lewis. And I saw the wounded Danvillians, the folks from a little textile town on the Dan River in Virginia, who had simply tried to exercise their right to vote and received billy clubs and handcuffs and jail time for doing it. I would urge, I would plead, I would beg those of you in the majority party to try to put yourself in the shoes of the generations of people whose forefathers were brought here in chains from Africa, who were worked tirelessly, who built the monuments in our nation's capital, but who were denied the right to vote. So this is not an abstract conversation we're having today, is it, folks? This is all too real. This state is known as the cradle of the civil rights movement. This state is the birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose leadership of a mass movement that changed the world is honored and recognized with an annual national holiday. Could we pause for a moment in this rush to shut down access to the ballot box? Make it harder, create more barriers, which this bill, Senate Bill 241, does. I mean, do we really just want to deliberately dishonor the history of all of those who fought so valiantly for the right to vote? We didn't get that voting rights bill in 1965 by a few legislative backroom deals, working night and day on a language of a bill. We got it by being in the streets. We got it by, Fannie Lou Hamer went down to vote in Sunflower County, Mississippi. By the time she got back home, she went down to register. By the time she got back home, she was being thrown out of her little shanty on that plantation where she and her husband picked cotton. It took her ultimately to the Atlantic City Democratic Convention, challenging the Mississippi delegation, an all-white Democratic, all-white Mississippi Party, where she so famously said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." I'm moved to tears by what the experience of Black Americans has been for 4 generations. I so concur with the gentleman from the 22nd when he said, could you listen to us, to those of us who have experienced the denial of voting rights? When we stand up and say this will create barriers, could you hear our voice? We're the very people that have encountered this and fought for it. I talked the other day about Bernice Johnson Reagan, a young music major down at Albany, Georgia, at Albany State College, who joined fellow students and marched downtown for the right to vote, who were then thrown out of college for that march, for participating, who went on to earn a PhD, become known worldwide, an incredible human being with a heart as big as the world. So I know individuals that mean a lot to me who fought and some who died for the right to vote. So this is not a tea party. This is not a Sunday afternoon walk in the park. This is tampering with the most fundamental right, and a right that has been fought for. It's our senator from the 15th. His mother got out and walked to her job as a domestic worker in Alabama, in that historic boycott around the ability to sit anywhere on a public bus that you chose to sit. He sits as the dean of the Senate. That was his mother. This is very real. This is not empty talk. It's not hollow rhetoric. It's people's lives. It's people's ability to genuinely participate in a democracy and have their voices heard. That's what this is about. That's why we stand before you today and urge you, open your eyes, open your hearts, look at the history and learn from it and do better. We don't have to continue this legacy of blocking access to the ballot. This is such a cloud over Georgia that these bills abound in our midst. We have 12 of them on the calendar today in this Senate chamber. We have omnibus bills, we have baby bills, we have adolescent bills, we have big boy bills. A dozen in a day about voting, as though we had had the crookedest election that the good Lord had ever seen. And it's not true. And in your hearts, I believe you know it's not true. Now, frankly, when you think about the fact that we had our current Secretary of State duly elected by the vote of Georgians, and our current governor both assert that the 2020 elections were conducted fairly with few, if any, issues. We heard elections officials at the county level all over the state say, well, they were pleased with how these elections went. And it was a massive turnout, a historic turnout. And we did it. We pulled it off. And we had a chance, each one of us in here and across the hall and in every position in government, we had a chance to unite as Georgians and stand behind the Secretary of State's assertions that he could demonstrate with, stand behind Gabe Sterling's assertions that their lives were being threatened for saying that our elections were fair. Their lives were being threatened. I dare say if any one of us were in that position, the position the Secretary of State was in, or Gabe Sterling, when they had the President of the United States calling down here, telling find some votes, I need a certain number of votes, just a few over 11,000, and it's on tape, and it's in every media market across the country that this happened, and our response here in Georgia is to see this plethora of election bills introduced. We had the chance. We could have united in defense of our election being conducted honestly, but because we know it was conducted honestly. The Secretary of State, who is a Republican, told us it is elected honestly. The governor did not cave in to a U.S. president pressuring, I want you to overturn this thing. And the best thing that we could have done coming into this session, and actually could have started a lot earlier than the session, was to say we're going to support our Secretary of State and our governor's assertion that this was an honest election. And that, yes, it was an outcome that's different than we've seen in Georgia in quite a while. But you chose not to do that. You chose not to stand against the big lie. We could do better. We could do better. People are outside this Capitol every day. People are filling our email boxes. People are calling us. People are watching. The world is watching. Every day there's a new national story on these voter suppression actions here in Georgia. Does that make us proud? Are we proud of that? We didn't have to be here. People could have found the moral fiber and the courage to stick with the truth. And it's beyond disappointing that that has not been the case. And you know, we've been in conversation ever since I've been here about voting. But of course, the U.S. Constitution, addressed who could vote and who could not. When my mother was born, she couldn't vote. She was not deemed eligible to vote because she was female. So this goes back. The arc of history is long. Join with us to bend towards justice. Join with us to bend towards justice. Dr. Lowry, again, another notable leader, an Alabaman who came over here and preached most of his life here in Georgia, said it very eloquently. He who was awarded the Medal of Freedom for his lifelong efforts, along with his wife, to lead us in marching towards justice and equality for all. Dr. Lowry said, "We've marched too long. We've bled too profusely. We've spent our time in jails. We have died too young. And we're not going to stop now. We're going to keep pushing and fighting to have full and equal rights in this nation." And every single person in the sound of my voice, and those that aren't in the sound of my voice, face that question. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? And what can you be proud to tell your grandchildren about what you did as an elected official? History will move on. We'll pass a voting rights bill again in Washington. These bills that are being pushed through by the majority party will be challenged in court. We'll spend enormous amounts of taxpayer dollars. We'll task counties with incredibly expensive steps that they're forced to take by these bills. And I say, because I believe that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I've seen it for too long. I believe it. I believe it, Senator from the 15th. I know you do too. We'll look back at this, and it will be that silly time. Like when they told Julian Bond he couldn't take his seat in the Georgia House of Representatives when he got elected right here in Atlanta, because he was too outspoken. We remember that, don't we? Senator from the 12th remembers it. A lot of us were around then. He had to have 3 elections because they kept denying him the right to take his oath. So folks, we have some mending of fences to do. We can rewrite history for Georgia and write it in a history that makes us proud and united. I dearly love many friends I have in the majority party. cherish friendships and relationships. But you've chosen as a body to embrace these draconian measures that take us back to the dark old days. I believe that we shall overcome, and that these laws won't prevail. And I would just wish and hope that friends of mine on both sides of the aisle could be on the same page and of one accord in taking Georgia down the bright future that lies ahead. You know, as we've debated here in very recent times, let's talk about the last 20 years. When Kathy Cox was Secretary of State, there were debates around the machines, what to buy, how to train, how to get them out across the state. We went through that same, under GOP rule, we went through the question of what to do with replacing those old machines that had a lot of problems. And do you know what the experts advised? There are many of you all that were in those committee meetings, in those hearings. The experts advised against the machines we've got right now. So there's legitimate concerns. People love the idea in the main of a paper ballot. And we don't have exactly that. We have something that's kind of called that. So there's been contention around how to proceed and how to run elections repeatedly. And those are important conversations. Would that we could stick with the facts, stick with the experts, and do the right thing. And the time is, it's never too late to do the right thing. So as you cast your vote on these bills, as you talk privately, and as you talk publicly back in your districts, we could have been united and said that Georgia did it right. Georgia had a clean election. Georgia had the most massive turnout of voters in the history of the state. Right now, we're not on that road, but it's never too late. Think again and try to do the right thing. You'll sleep better at night, and you'll have something to tell your grandchildren that you can really be proud of. I'm not going to go into more particulars about the problematic things in these bills, but I'll just close and asking each of us to look into our hearts and work to get in touch with the reality of where we are as state leaders and look for ways to come together and do the right thing, not turn back the clock. If there are any questions, I'm happy to yield. If not, I'm happy to yield to questions, or I'll yield the well.
You have questions, Senator.
Thank you.
You have questions, Senator. Senator, in 40 seconds, recognized for a question.
Oh, I yield, yes. I think your mic's not working. Maybe.
Is it possible to turn on? This one's on. Great. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Will the senator yield?
I yield.
Isn't it true that when we purchased these new voting machines in 2019, that was done on a party line vote?
You are correct. It was done on a party line vote, the decision to buy these machines.
And isn't that because there was a lot of testimony in committee about the fact that these particular machines, these ballot marking devices, are a less secure and far more expensive alternative to some of the other systems that could have been under consideration?
That's very true, Senator from the 42nd. That was certainly here, and you are correct in that assertion.
And is it not true that I believe might have, although I'm somewhat confused, been referenced by the senator from the 28th earlier, that I gave a speech trying to get the message across to the Georgia Senate why purchasing these machines wasn't in the best interests of Georgia taxpayers or voters?
I'm sure you're correct.
And is it not true that I still believe every word I said in 2019?
If the senator so states, I am quite sure.
And would that not be because we still should have bought a less expensive and more secure system?
That's certainly what I wish had happened, and I was dismayed and amazed at the willingness to just overwhelm the testimony that was brought, because it was brought several times by eminent experts, Georgia Tech-based experts and others who had vast knowledge about voting mechanisms.
You are correct, Senator. If you'll yield for a couple more.
I will.
Isn't it also true that we know that our machines were not hacked, and in fact, they worked correctly during the 2020 election because we did multiple recounts, including a hand recount of the human readable text?
Yes, the senator is accurate in stating that we had multiple recounts and that were very fine-tuned.
And isn't it also true that we had experts at the national level, such as the summarily fired Christopher Krebs, who was the head of the security agency, the acronym I'm forgetting right now, made very clear that this was the most secure election, in fact, in recent history?
I'm very glad you brought that up, and that should be repeated because it's been far too ignored. But he got fired for asserting that. He got fired by the president's folks for saying that this was the most secure election we had had. That was a national expert whose job it was to oversee the security that was in question around elections, and he continued even after he was fired. He never veered from his account, which was fact-based. I'm so glad that you brought that up. That's not unimportant.
So, Senator, wouldn't you agree that it is not in conflict to believe that we could have and should have purchased a more economical and more secure voting system, and yet know and believe that there was no widespread fraud in our recent elections due to the things that we've already been discussing?
The senator's correct. I really bemoaned that purchase. At the same time, there are things that I applauded that the Secretary of State did in his current role, and that was to really send a message that he wanted to expand access to voting, and he sent out 6 million absentee ballot applications to voters to encourage that, taking the state in the right direction. I'm sorry people fail to understand that. He's a member of their party who was standing up and doing the right thing, and now we're having legislation introduced that actually, without saying it directly, undermines some of his authority. And I'm sorry to see that.
Oh, I am too. Final question, if you'll answer.
Yes.
Isn't it true that I'm so pleased that now 2 years later, I could give my speech from 2 years ago in the 42nd, and the senator from the 28th can give it in the 28th, and we both would get applause. Isn't that true, Senator?
Amen. I'll yield the well.
Senator, you have additional questions? The senator has yielded the well. Call upon Senator from the 5th. Speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm glad to see all my colleagues are so excited today to debate this bill. You know what? After the last election, only thing we heard about voter fraud, election security. Since I came to the body for this session, only thing I'm hearing and seeing all the bills about voter suppressions. You know what? I'm not here arguing the bill. I'm going to give you all some unsolicited advice to my colleague from the opposition side. Instead of doing all this bill, I want you to think something else, something out of the box. Why not try to reach out all the voters in Georgia, people looks like me, people like us. Don't just look at people, try to satisfy your constituency. Georgia is changing. Georgia has already changed. That's why I'm here. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. If you reach out, the folks like me, looks like me, talks like me, you might be able to hold on to power. You really do. That's what you need to work on it. That's what you need to work on it. You are proud to say Georgia is #1 in business. Let's be proud. Georgia is a welcome state. Georgia is #1 for voter participation. We can do better. We can do a lot better. So instead of wasting our time trying to put each other down, let's find some solution. Let's find some common ground. Let's reach out to folks. I may look different, but I'm not dangerous. I'm just like you all. The people that I represent have the same value that you have, your constituency have. I may have come from different countries for better life, for better education, for whatever, to make this country, great. This is a great country. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Let's keep it that way. Let's not try to suppress the voter. If you really want to win the election, let's win the heart of the people. Let's win it. That's the only way we can move Georgia forward. And that's the only way we can make not Georgia great, this country greater than ever before. Let's work together to move this state forward, not backward. Thank you, Mr. President. If I don't have any questions, I'll yield the well.
The senator has yielded the well. Senator from the 15th is recognized to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate your time, and I'll be brief, but I just wanted to take you back a bit to how it sort of started for my incursion into this earth and my family, and sort of a history of how we got over. And I wanted to share it with you in the context of watching my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, who worked on 25 acres of land sharecropping on the Yarborough Place in Prattville, Alabama, and my grandmother, her industry of collecting eggs under the house and taking them to a barter system in Prattville to trade for meal and things like that. In addition, my mother, Annabelle Minder, inspiration for me in a lot of ways. She was not an educated woman per se, but she had high integrity. And the moral of what I'm saying is they were valuable people. They taught me everything I knew. They taught me survivor skills, and they taught me to respect myself, but more importantly, they taught me to respect other people. And one of the things that she would always talk about is how that I should always be a first-class citizen, and that entailed voting. That entailed the belief that America is a place for even you, and I use the term deliberately. Even you can grow up to be a voter, to make your voice heard, and be a real citizen in America. And we subscribe to that. Coming up in Trentham Court in Montgomery, Alabama, we transitioned to the bus boycott, and that theme, that fire in your soul, that fire in your spirit that says, I can be a first-class citizen. I can be first, because Dr. King said I could be first. We heard those sermons over and over again until they were embedded into our souls, and we exonerated his words by walking, being his legs, making sure his mission was done during the bus boycott. But we got to the next transition of voting, and there became these rolling roadblocks. Not just roadblocks, but rolling roadblocks. That is, they would change the course, they would change direction to fit the circumstances of progress for what were perceived as Black Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. And so that feeling, that sensitivity that we have, that I have towards watching this play out it comes to full fruition for me when I see that and say, what's going on here? Why can't we understand? Somebody once said it this way, why can't we all get along and understand that your rights end where mine began and vice versa? Walk a mile in my shoe, walk a mile in our shoe, and understand that as you progress, we progress. As we progress, you progress. And it takes a super effort to hold somebody down. The only way you can keep a man or woman in the ditch is by being in there yourself to expend valuable human energy. It's not worth it. Let us make sure that we walk towards that utopian place where we all are Americans. We can all reach out and say, you're my brother, you're my sister. Let's be good and kind to one another. Let's live up to the ideals espoused by our forefathers when they founded this country. This is a great experiment. Let us not let someone tear it down. Let no one. We fought wars to make sure that we don't give in to tyrants across the sea. Let's not give in the same thing among ourselves. We're better than that. We're great human beings, and I subscribe to the belief that we can all achieve. We can all believe in one another. Don't diss one another. Don't give up on one another. Let's not create a void in this Senate, in this state that can be averted by just a little mercy. A little mercy. Ain't nothing wrong with a little mercy, but it moderates understanding, to make you understand what is going on other than just hard, cold words. You got to put the spirit in there. The spirit is just like the senator from the 29th talks about the law. There's the letter of the law, like he talks about, and there's the spirit of the law that he discusses. And he's right. Just justice without mercy is no good. It's never any good. We have got to make sure that everybody that wants to vote in a reasonable context can vote. And not just talking about when you say you want to change something, you don't want to use a hacksaw, you want to tweak it and make it better. Not just take a hacksaw and do it willy-nilly because we're panicked because of some unseen thing going on. Fairness is fair. Right is right even if you don't agree with it. And wrong is wrong even if you agree with it. And we've got to find that in our soul and our nature. Rolling blocks, unnatural and legal barriers that define one as a citizen as American. All sorts of tactics are used to block access to the polls sometimes. I'm looking back in the past now, and it's coming forward with me. The people of Montgomery, as an example, were resilient, long-suffering, but resolute to keep their eye on the prize because they knew that when you take your eye off your prize, the things you see are obstacles. Obstacles are the things you see when you take your eye off your goal. But if you're a natural man, a natural woman, you'll recognize that you can achieve and be a real citizen. Please let us join together. Let us be part of this great melting pot, pouring our little flavor to this soup, and I think we'll achieve greatness together. Many African Americans have tried this. Americans are black. Americans are white. They're men, they're women, increasingly women. So we've got to make sure that this works for us, not for anybody else, for us. And just because I disagree with you don't mean I don't like you. Just because we disagree doesn't mean that we can't come to an understanding. We've got to stay on this ship together because otherwise we'll sink like fools. And I know we are not fools. We're noble men and women on the same course. Mr. President, if there are no questions, I yield the well.
There are no questions, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from the 15th speaks with great passion. Call upon the senator from the 34th to speak the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. I rise because our freedom to vote is under attack. Some say it's not, but I represent Clayton County. And we showed up and voted like we never voted before. And now, Senate Bill 241 is taking us back. All of the things that we were able to accomplish just by exercising our right to vote, we did. Let me just stop for a moment and take us back in history just for a minute. Because historically, most black people primarily voted for the Republican Party prior to 1965. And that's because they credited President Lincoln with freeing black people from bondage. But after 1965, the black people left the Republican Party, and because the Republican Party had opened its doors to white supremacy, Democrats took on policies of being more inclusive and tolerant. I can't forget a freshman in this building, but I was over on the House side. We changed Georgia's flag. Yeah. I can't forget that we changed Georgia's flag. I can't forget that because I was told that prior to my being there, they didn't have the numbers. But when I came, the numbers made it happen. So I'm going to take credit for it. My vote made it happen. However, the next year, I came to this chamber, because I only served one term over on the House side. But that was the same year that former Governor Sonny Perdue had switched parties and became a Republican governor, but the state of Georgia voted in a Democratic Senate. Some of y'all didn't get that. Let me say it again. The state of Georgia voted for a Republican governor, which, by the way, Sonny Perdue was a Democrat, but then when he switched parties, he became the Republican governor. But this chamber was still voted by the people as Democrats. But the governor, Sonny Perdue, offered chairmanships and whatever else, and had 4 switchers. And that's when we became a Republican Senate in Georgia. Why am I talking about that? Because I can't forget it. Let me tell you one of the main reasons why. Because when we changed the flag, flaggers left a snake skin with a note in my home mailbox. You talking about terror? I didn't know what to do. I mean, I called Clayton County. They came to my house, and, you know, the sheriff wanted to put me up security around my house. I said, no. But we did close in our carport and made it a garage. I mean, we ain't crazy. We ain't gonna allow me to keep coming in and out when there are some who are mean enough to literally put a snakeskin in your mailbox. That's acknowledging I know where you live. That's terror. Now, I can't say that I was around when the lynching and everything else was going on, but I can't forget the history. But I will say this latest insurrection with those Confederate flags going into our nation's capital, gave me flashbacks and the heebie-jeebies.
Senator-
At least that's what they
Senator-
call me.
Senator, I ask you to stay on the topic, stay on addressing the bill, please.
All I'm gonna finish saying, then I'll
Thank
follow
you.
that. Yes, sir. That is why I rise against this bill, because it is taking us away from being inclusive, working together, and having tolerance and utilizing our right to vote. With that, Mr. President, I'm going to yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. Call upon the senator from the 9th to speak to the bill.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. So, what is the purpose of 241? What's the real purpose? The purpose of 241 and all of the vote limiting bills that we have before us is to validate a lie. It is to prevent massive voter turnout from happening again, especially in minority communities, our new voters who are turning 18, and our hardworking Georgians, our working class Georgians. We want to have a bill to make it harder for these groups to vote. Now, I take 241 personally. I've said before that I come from a family. My grandmother grew up in Jim Crow. She was afraid to go vote. She would hear stories like what happened in Oconee in 1920, when a massive mob of white voters attacked Black Americans, killed them, all because they showed up to go vote. And this is where we're coming back to. So I would argue that absentee voting might actually, especially in light of the insurrection that we saw down at the Capitol, might be a safer choice for Black Americans at this point than standing in a line instead of faced with intimidation and those that will prevent them from voting. That would take us back. So here we are in the United States, the great state of Georgia, which has a storied history of voter suppression, unparalleled in the nation, having advanced to judiciously allow all its citizens the freedom to exercise their right to vote. And we experienced historical turnout in the 2020 presidential election, freely and fairly reflecting the will of the people. Long before the 2020 presidential election, there came a voice from the largest megaphone on the planet declaring that if an incumbent president was not re-elected, it would be because the election would be riddled with fraud and therefore stolen from those who supported him. This drumbeat became more and more intense as the election neared. By the time the election was decided, the supporters of the incumbent president have been programmed to believe these statements were true. There were attacks made on the absentee ballot process and allegations that the process itself opened the floodgates for illegal ballots to be cast in an election that was supposedly stolen. This untruth became so embedded in the minds of many voters, and is why we're standing here today, pushing back against 241, that it prompted an insurrection and an act of sedition against our own government at the very seat of democracy. Keep in mind that absentee ballots have been used in the past without contention and even promoted here to the constituents of the party that now seeks to constrain the use by voters who may oppose them. The big lie of fraudulent votes, illegal votes, along with conspiracy theories have been disproven, debunked by numerous recounts, audits, election officials, both Democrat and Republicans, and over 60 courts headed by both Democratic and Republican judges, some even appointed by the incumbent administration, all the way to the highest court in the land. The big lie of widespread voter fraud perpetuated by a man void of integrity to concede his lost election that has been discredited on every front. And it has not gone unnoticed that the targets of these allegations have been urban areas with the largest African American and minority votes, all areas with high concentrations of African American minority voters. Are we going back to literacy tests in order to prove ourselves, people that look like me, that we're worthy of the right to constitutionally vote? I take these attacks seriously. You all in this room that are supporting this bill, you're telling people like me and my family that we can't vote, that our vote doesn't matter. And you want to make it harder, as if we haven't struggled enough to get here. The reason I'm standing here, the reason I can vote, is because I had family members, people that I've known that were willing to die for me to have the right to vote and to stand here today. Many of you in this chamber won your elections with absentee ballots, ironically making it possible for you to have the ability right now to submit vote-limiting legislation. Were your elections fraudulent too? Why did the allegations of fraud not extend to states won by the incumbent president? Now, this August body established to serve all the people justly are proposing an omnibus bill of legislation like 241 designed to make the right to exercise the people's right to vote more difficult and challenging. Working parents are unable to spend precious waking hours making arrangements to take time off to vote, standing in long lines, or weeding through a complicated process of an absentee ballot request. And this is what we're asking them to do. The fact that elected officials put these challenges in place, plus deliberately add new ones, is an affront to all Georgians. The ability to cast a ballot should not be an award given after all the obstacles have been met. The vote and the right to vote is sacred to our democracy and the maintenance thereof. Why would anyone seek to make this process more difficult, resulting in exclusion rather than inclusion? Your decisions in this body will have a far-reaching and unintended consequence. Voting is party neutral. The challenges you set could restrict your own voters. And the last thing you want to do is have one of your voters standing in a line to cast a vote for you, waiting for hours. There was no massive voter fraud. The current president won by over 8 million votes and won the Electoral College by large margins. The bills moving through this legislative body to put oppressive election laws in place are simply formulating solutions in search of a problem that does not exist. Truth crushed the ground. Truth is being crushed to the ground, but it will rise again. Don't find yourselves on the wrong side of history. And I just want to point out that, as a humble freshman, I do take notice of the senators that are excused. I believe they're senators from very competitive districts. Everyone out there, pay attention. Why are they excused? Why are they not here? I think any of the proposed voting barrier legislation, it's not going to stop any of us from mobilizing voters. This will backfire. It will blow up in your face.
Senator, please stay on the topic of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm nearly done. And with that, I really am done. Just remember your constituents. Try to reach out, as has been pointed out, to voters that don't look like you. And I ask you all to vote no on 241. I yield the will.
Senator, you have one question if you'd like to take it. Senator from the 40th.
Who's the 40? Yeah, yes. I yield. I mean, not I yield. I will take the question. Yes.
Friendly questions to the Senator of the Well. Do you yield?
Yes.
So you remember the 2018 election, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember that in 2018 we voted on decades-old machines that couldn't really produce recounts because there was no paper ballot?
I do.
Do you remember that we had an exact match law, which you live in Gwinnett County, right?
Yes.
And that county had a disproportionate number of ballots rejected due to that exact match law, and that the courts needed to intervene. Do you remember that?
I remember that.
Do you remember that particularly in your county, how long the lines were, that people were waiting 4 to 8 hours?
Yes.
Do you remember that there were hundreds of polling places that were closed across the state, particularly polling places used by people of color?
Absolutely, and some did not even have machines on Election Day.
That's right. So now let's jump to 2020. Do you remember that our Secretary of State, our Lieutenant Governor, and our Governor all stated that there was no widespread voter fraud?
That is correct.
So isn't it true that the stated problems in 2018 were real, and that the problems of 2020 were not real?
The senator knows what she speaks.
Thank you, Senator.
I yield the well.
The senator from the 10th is recognized to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, and members of this body. I rise in opposition to this bill for a number of reasons. One, I didn't get an opportunity to ask the author of this bill, the senator from the 30th, questions that would have been important for me to gain a better understanding, as well as my constituents, of this legislation. You cannot pass a bill like this without taking the questions and answering all the questions that members from the minority party and probably others in here may have regarding this legislation. To get up and take 30 minutes to tell us what's in front of us that we can read makes absolutely no sense to me. I certainly would have preferred for the senator from the 30th to stand up here and say, you have the bill in front of you, now what questions do you have? I probably would have sat down, probably wouldn't have even been up here in the well, because I would have had an opportunity to ask him about why would you want to make a hotline at our Attorney General's office, the same AG that was accused of supporting the Stop the Steal up in Washington, D.C. The same Attorney General who chairs the Republican AG Association, and by extension his Rule of Law Defense Fund that donated money to the same organization that planned the insurrection up in Washington, D.C. I would have asked the senator from the 30th that question. I would have asked the senator from the 30th, why has no one in here duly elected across this state or been accused, anyone in their district, of having fraudulently voted in their own personal districts? We represent the 56 Senate districts that make up this great state, and I've not heard a complaint from any one of us in this chamber that says someone in our districts voted fraudulently. And if we are those that represent this great state, the question to ask had I had an opportunity from the senator from the 30th, would have been, if there isn't any voter fraud in your districts or any of our other districts, where is the voter fraud in this great state? I didn't get that opportunity to ask the question because the only thing I heard from the author of this legislation is what I'd already read in the bill. What I've already seen go through committee, and those of us that sit on the committee had already vetted this legislation. We knew what was in this bill. There are so many unanswered questions that I have regarding this legislation, and I don't want members of my own caucus to answer them. I'd much rather have the answers from the senator from the 30th. And I know he's going to close out this debate, but it truly isn't a debate when you don't have an opportunity to engage the person who drafted this legislation. Had I had an opportunity to ask the senator from the 30th questions about his legislation, I would have asked him, how do you define voter suppression? How do you simply define voter suppression? And where is the problem that this legislation is seeking to address? I don't know what the senator from the 30th would have said because I didn't get that opportunity to ask him that question. But let me tell you what I know about voter suppression. Let me tell you what I've lived through, having been a child born in this red clay of Georgia, birthed in the civil rights movement back in the 60s. Having been someone, not just me, but my other family members, subjected to Jim Crow laws. Laws where they put a box in front of you and ask you to guess how many beans is in that box, even though you can't see through it or even come up with some kind of idea to count it. Somebody whose parents marched in the civil rights movement and were afraid to go to the polls and vote, so they had to unite. I would have asked the senator from the 30th, how do you feel about people of color and the history they shared in the deep, deep South of this country? I would have asked him, how do you feel about black women voted in record numbers, even though they pulled down jobs and family responsibilities and during this pandemic, but yet you want to take away the right from them to vote absentee? I would have asked him about how do you feel about those queer and trans folks, people in our community, citizens in our community, and their ability, even though they may have what some would consider the non-traditional household. I would have asked him about how should I address my cousin, 26 years old, who severed the second spine in her back, who's now paralyzed from the waist down, and how is she supposed to vote?
Senator, please restrict your comments to the bill itself.
Mr. President, these are comments related to the bill. Thank you. I would have asked the senator from the 30th, how do you deal with the low income and those that are unhoused? I would have asked the senator from the 30th, how do you deal with elderly people of color and their ability just to find transportation and mobility sometime to be able to move around to go to a poll and vote? You see, the true voter fraud in this bill is his attempt to even try and find voter fraud where none exist. And the true voter suppression is people in power trying to suppress the vote of those that are not. But I agree with those who's come before me and those that have spoken on this issue because we know Georgia in 2020 turned blue. We also know that in 2022, Georgia is going to be even bluer. But the only reason I heard throughout this most recent election why this bill was even needed was not from the senator from the 30th, but from the former president of these United States. And I remember on back on election night in November, where the president said, only if they had stopped counting the absentee ballots, I would have won. That's the real reason why over 43 states and submitted over 400 pieces of legislation dealing with this issue called absentee ballot. That's the real reason. And if I was an attorney, I would tell you I know something about the lick law because that's where the rubber meets the road, as we would say in the hood. But I didn't get a chance to get those kind of questions asked or even answered. But I know, and we all know, having grown up in this red clay, where the real voter suppression is. But I can tell you, we just ain't gonna stop now. We don't care. And I certainly pray that the Justice Department in DC does something and stands up like we put them in power to do. Mr. President, if there aren't any questions, then I'll take my seat.
You have no questions, Senator.
Thank you, I yield the well.
Call upon the senator from the 31st to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I rise to speak on 241, and I support 241. I don't have a speech. I don't have eloquent thoughts to share. Just an average dude from West Georgia that is here to represent my citizens in our 3 counties in this state capital. I was born in DeKalb County, went to DeKalb County high schools, proud to live there. My family moved here in the early 1960s. My dad moved here, married my mom after he got out of the Army, grew up in Puerto Rico. And my mom, when she moved down here in the early 60s, in the midst of the civil rights movement, marrying a guy that's, quite frankly, a lot different complexion than my skin color, a dark guy. My late brother looks way more Puerto Rican than I do, just to be totally real and totally frank, and I've known many of you for many years and have shared these stories. But what bothers me, or kind of the tone I hear today, when we should be working together and we should be talking about issues that matter to us, is what I'm hearing is that the 2.5 million voters that voted in November who are Republican and maybe have concerns, and yeah, you know, I think there's a spectrum of people, what they believe and what they don't believe, et cetera, and we can debate that a whole another time, another place. But they have a right to have their voice heard in this Capitol, just like the other party. Every Georgian has a right to be heard, whether you believe them, whether you disagree with them, it doesn't matter. And to put down the people in my district in West Georgia, the home of Tom Murphy from Bremen, Georgia, who was the Speaker of the House during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and the times of many of our families who have been here for all our lives, for many generations to come, have their right to be, their voice to be heard in this Capitol, just as those that live in Atlanta, or Dalton, or Savannah, or Valdosta. So we can get up here and we can give political speeches all we want, so we can get them and use them next year when we run for office again and do all that stuff. But the people are paying attention. You're right, they are paying attention. And they're going to remember how we vote on all these bills. And I may respectfully disagree with my friends across the aisle on where they stand on these issues. But as the son of the father who served in Vietnam and served in the Army and shed blood for this country, yes, everybody has a right to vote. Everybody has a right for a transparent, secure election that they believe is fair. Every Georgian, we need to get everybody back together on the same page. That's where we need to go. But if we don't address the concerns of some voters in this state, we are never going to get there. I'm not going to stand up here and lecture y'all. Y'all have your belief system. Everybody in this room already has their minds up on how we're voting. So we're going to spend 3 hours and we're going to talk about whatever it is we want to talk about. So your political ads and my political ads and everything resonates back at home, right? We did the right thing. But at the end of the day, my voters in West Georgia, in Paulding County, in Cedartown, in Bremen, in Tallapoosa, in Hiram, their voice counts. And you may not like how I vote, you may criticize how I vote. I'm sure, I'll get more tweets from LeBron James and other folks about how I vote and how I'm suppressing votes. But at the end of the day, every vote should count in this state. And I pray over every single one of us as we move forward through this process and throughout this day and we leave this state capitol, that we find a way to make sure all Georgians trust the process, but they all trust their government at the end of the day. And Mr. President, I yield the well.
Call upon the senator from the 12th to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, crossover day has come again, and it will surely pass away. And just as it passes away, rural Georgians will remain the forgotten stepchildren of this great state. Voting access will be seriously disrupted or maybe altogether vanish for many hardworking, low-paid, tax-paying voters of rural Georgia if SB 241 passes. Many areas in my district have already lost voting precincts based on the premise that there weren't enough voters in those areas, or it was too expensive to maintain them. Although voting takes place sporadically and is not a daily, monthly, or even an annual occurrence, closures took place anyway. Senators, we have nothing left to close. We have nothing to throw away. We have nothing to alter, nothing to dismiss. There's absolutely nothing left. We have complied with every rational and yes, even irrational proposals related to voting. And in order to vote in Southwest Georgia, we have always followed the voting rules. In order to vote in Southwest Georgia, we have presented everybody's birth certificate, driver's license, grandma, grandpa, Uncle Joe, Bubba. So there is nothing left to present at the polling precincts to prove that we are legitimate voters. For decades, this country has sent us, U.S. citizens to other countries to assure fair and free elections. And now my rural Georgia constituents, right here at home, whether Republicans or Democrats or independents, worry about future access to voting. Taking away absentee voting for rural Georgians means longer drives to the polling places. Many of those rural citizens lack transportation to get anywhere. Taking away absentee voting for rural areas means seriously impacting people with disabilities who struggle to get from one room to the other in their homes. Taking away absentee voting for rural Georgia means impeding voters who possess debilitating health conditions. Colleagues, please remember, rural voters helped to elect our present governor and many Republican legislators in this Capitol. And now these same voters worry about how they will access the voting booth. These are not just Democratic voters, as some may think. They belong to all of us. And if you think otherwise, continue to roll the dice and see how that works out for you in 2022. Thank you, Mr. President, and I'll yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from the 33rd is recognized to speak to the bill. 43rd, beg your pardon. 43rd, 43. That's you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Bill 241. And I want to thank the senator from the 31st for reminding us how veterans have fought for this country to have those freedoms. My father is a Korean War veteran, and I, too, am an Air Force veteran. And voting is the cornerstone of our democracy. Senate Bill 241 is an extreme rollback of voting access. Voter suppression bills create a cascade of hurdles for voters as they attempt to vote early or absentee. We shouldn't make it harder for counties to provide voters with options regarding where and how to vote. We've heard the numbers. Over 1.3 million Georgians voted by absentee ballot for general election, and nearly 1.1 million voted in the runoff. That's 1 out of every 4 Georgia voter who decided in the middle of a global pandemic that has killed almost 500,000 in our country and over 16,000 in Georgia to vote safely and securely by absentee ballot. If our goal is to reduce the administrative burden on elections offices, the best solution would be pass a bill like Senate Bill 38, which allows people to automatically renew their absentee ballot request without submitting any paperwork to the elections office. Or Senate Bill 64, which would make Election Day a state holiday. I've submitted this bill for 2 years in a row and will continue to do so until it is passed. We should not be debating whether we want to reduce administrative burdens on elections offices while simultaneously passing a bill that dramatically increases the burden by eliminating no excuse absentee voting. Nor should we try to punish organizations that are merely trying to help people vote. Certainly, we shouldn't be punishing citizens who choose to use their power to access the ballot box and vote. We shouldn't make it harder to register, cast a ballot, or have their ballot counted. My colleague, senator from the 15th, spoke in the morning order this morning and mentioned that yesterday, just yesterday, exactly yesterday, was 56 years since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was birthed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 demands equal access to the ballot box. And here we are in 2021, when Democrats and many black people and other people of color voted, and the election results proved to be favorable. We're here fighting the same fight. As a young 8-year-old black girl, I watched the segregation videos, not by choice, but because my parents wanted me to know where we've come from and how to accept the torch and continue to fight. And they said, run. And they said, fight. And that day, 1965, freedom writers, singers sang a song. And the lyrics go like this: ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Turn me around, turn me around. And they went on in each stanza, each verse of that song. They said, ain't gonna let nobody, not segregation or Jim Crow or racism or hatred or injustice, nobody, and nothing turn me around. I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul. Yeah, y'all know I'm a minister, and I got to throw it in here. when he said in Romans 8:31, what then shall we say to these things? See, Paul was oppressed and afflicted. He was beaten and imprisoned. And the senator from the 25th calls my road Jesus Junction, so I may as well just go there. What then shall we say to these things? What things? Voter suppression, inequality, inequity, injustice, and hatred. What then shall we say to these things? We shall say that if God be for us, no one can be against us. So I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, keep on fighting, and marching up to Freedom Land. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The senator from the 44th is recognized to speak to the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, I am opposed to any legislation to turn back the hands of time when it comes to civil rights and social justice issues, which definitely includes voting rights. I really want to make a couple of points about the Senate Bill 241, which restricts voting access for many Georgia, especially Black people. This bill will ban mobile voting locations except in emergencies. Mobile voting helps people, and there's no proof of security issues. So why stop it? This is a valuable tool. It costs a lot of money to create, and it's working. And now we want to get rid of it. Why? Why would the state stop any county from offering this mobile voting unit when it works? We just want access to the polls. Then the second thing, this bill requires a court order to extend voting hours, such as when the precinct gets started late. I don't need a court order to do that. When there was something wrong in my precinct, right after the polls opened, seniors called me, and I went there and asked the manager, the election manager, to take care of the problem. Then the third thing, it creates a felony for anyone that sees how someone else votes. That's Section 21. I just have problems with all of that. And then it creates a voter intimidation and election fraud hotline by the Attorney General. He already is under scrutiny. His office is under scrutiny for some comments, negative comments he made during the election. So I don't trust anything he says. And then if we have this voter hotline, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I understand over $300,000. Well, the state of Georgia, we have a problem now of trying to get some money for food banks and food pantries, and we want to spend that kind of money to the AG's office. This bill will allow the state to recommend the Board of Elections be removed. Then the state legislative delegation can replace the board with the members of their own choosing. Well, I disagree with that. Senate Bill 241 will repeal no excuse absentee voting. That's making voting more difficult. Now, I grew up in the segregated South in Georgia, and remember when Black people in areas across this country had to count correctly the number of jelly beans on a jar and other things in order to register to vote. Medgar Evers was killed in the driveway of his house with his children and wife looking on by white supremacists because of his participation in trying to get people registered to vote. And then the former member of this Georgia legislative body, the General Assembly, the former Reverend Hosea Williams, and former Congressman John Lewis led a voting rights march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was called Bloody Sunday, because so many people got blooded that day in nonviolent march when law enforcement officers beat them, women and children. Then Dr. C.T. Vivian beaten on the courthouse steps trying to register to vote. Too much blood has been shed for our right to vote, but we're going to vote anyway. We cannot sit here in this body and accept this bill, Senate Bill 241 and others, to be positive steps toward a better process to voting in the state of Georgia. So because I lived in a racist society and saw the Ku Klux Klan marching down Main Street, Jonesboro, on Saturday morning, I know racism when I see it. This is not about the process. This is about suppressing the vote of a certain group of people, especially me, and people who look like me, and I take it personally. I am here in this chamber because of the Voting Rights Act. And I'm gonna vote that way. I'm gonna vote not to suppress the vote. Anyone who wants to boycott this debate in this chamber today can do it. You have the right to do it. But please know, when we participate this week in national calls with civil rights and social justice organization, we're going to explain Georgia's voter suppression bills and the leadership in Georgia. And we will say what Georgia's leaders have done with this Senate Bill 241 and in the Georgia State Senate. So some good-hearted legislators, this is what this bill is all about. Some good-hearted legislators want to please a former selfish, racist leader and his followers. Well, I tell you today, don't do it. Don't bring forth these voter suppression bills. Stand up and do the right thing. Just stand up and don't do it. Do not bring these bills forth. Mr. President, I yield the well.
Thank you, Senator. You caught me by surprise. I was having a snack. I call upon the gentleman from the second to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, I rise today to speak in opposition to Senate Bill 241. Its enactment would create unnecessary burdens for some people of this great state. Its enactment would not only create unnecessary burdens, but disproportionately impact the voting rights of people of color. It would affect the elderly, people with disabilities, low income, people who live in rural Georgia, students across this great state and out of this state, and the veterans who live in nursing homes. It is estimated that 300,000 eligible voters will not have their ability to vote if this is enacted, because they lack a driver license, because they lack a voter ID. And I know the argument. The argument is that a voter's ID is easy. The argument is that a voter ID is free, but it fails to take into account that the cost of the time to go leave your job to get a voter ID. What you don't take into fact that you need transportation to leave your job to find a place to get your voter ID. It don't take into account of those who don't have a car. or those who live in rural Georgia, or those counties in rural Georgia that don't have a building to go to that offer a voter ID. You know, it smells like Jim Crow laws in the past. This smells like poll taxing. It smells like voter suppression. And you know, I represent Savannah, Georgia, and I drive from 16 to 75 into Atlanta. And 5 o'clock, when I get up in the morning to ride in the road, it's dark. And when you're going down 16, you know if there's a deer carcass is in the road. Sometimes there's a frightened skunk nearby, and you can't see that skunk, or can you see that deer carcass, but you can smell it, and it stinks. Senate Bill 241 stinks. You know, you don't have to read it, but you know it stinks. Just like I ride down 16, I know there's a deer carcass nearby because I can smell the stench. Nearly 17% of Georgians lack access to a vehicle. Nearly 17% of Georgians live 10 miles away from a state ID issuing facility. But absentee is common in many parts of Georgia. Absentee is common in many parts of the United States. In Oregon, they vote almost entirely by absentee. In Washington State, in Colorado, many of the residents vote by absentee with no issues. To restrict access to absentee by mail would create longer lines on election day. It would create an extra cost for the people in this great state because we need more voting machines. We need more poll watchers. We need, it will cause more logistical issues. Silencing minority votes is being heard around this country. Silencing minority votes in Georgia is being heard around the world. You could cut on CNN. It's talked about. You could read the New York Times. They're talking about voter suppression in Georgia. NBC, CBS, ABC. They're talking about voter suppression in Georgia as it affects minorities, as it affects rural Georgia, as it affects elderly veterans who live in nursing homes. 300,000 people this will affect. And I know you say, you know, we have more than 11 million people in Georgia. What is 300,000? But what if it was your 300,000? What if you was a part of that 300,000? Would it make a difference? Would it make a difference? And I'm telling you, yes, it would. If you couldn't vote, if you couldn't get access to the voting polls, if you was disabled and couldn't drive. Thomas Jefferson once said, "The greatest danger to American freedom is a government that ignores its people." 300,000 Georgians we're ignoring. 300,000 Georgians we're ignoring. We're not giving them access to exercise their right. Many members of this General Assembly, in fact, all of us talk about inclusion. We all talk about the least of us that we need to help. We all talk about protecting the working man, protecting the working woman, protecting Georgia's families. But I'm here to tell you that voting is the pillar of democracy in Georgia. It's the pillar of democracy in America. And we should be encouraging everyone to exercise their right to vote. we should preserve this freedom of absentee ballots. What you do today has a far greater impact of what you say. You talk about inclusion, you talk about freedom, you talk about the least of us. But what you do in a few minutes when we vote has a far better impact of what you say. My friends, Senate Bill 241 will create barriers, gradually restricting voters from their free ability to vote. And eventually, this legislation will essentially eradicate the freedom for some citizens of this great state. It was not so long ago that we had laws on this book that restricted Georgians from voting. We called them Jim Crow laws that restricted African Americans, where African Americans were restricted from where they could eat, restricted from where they could live, restricted from where they could socialize, restricted from where they can gather. Jim Crow laws were on the books. It wasn't that long ago. And now we're under attack again. But I know this attack. I have lived this attack because it was told to me by stories. And many of you know I'm from a little small town called Alamo, Georgia. And my grandfather was a sharecropper. Some of you may call it a tenant. But he could not vote until my mother was 24 years old. Because as a tenant farmer, the owner of the farm told him that if he voted, he would be kicked off the land. So my grandfather had to decide as a young man whether that he was going to feed his family or vote. Whether or not he was going to take care of the children and his wife or vote. So it wasn't until my mom went to college and was able to afford to buy a house and some land so they can move off that tenant land and live in a house in the city of Alamo, Georgia. And the proudest day my grandfather was saying is that after they brought that house and off that other man's land, that he had the opportunity to walk to the polls to vote. He was 55 years old. Waited his whole life to vote. Now we're talking about restricting people's abilities to vote. But as you take time to vote today, and we debate, think about me driving 5 o'clock this morning to make it here this morning, and think about what I smelled in the road. I urge you to don't vote Senate Bill 241. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the will.
Senator, you do have a question. That's all right. Senator from the 55th is recognized to speak to the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Over the course of the past few weeks, even today, through our committee process, through the media, and through conversations, we have all talked a lot about voting rights and voter suppression. So today, I just want to talk a little facts, feelings, and freedom. We've talked a great deal about absentee ballots. We've talked a lot about ballot drop-off boxes. We've talked a lot about signature matches. We've talked a lot about voter ID. Some have spent a great deal of time talking about election fraud or a stolen election. We've been presented a great deal of information about how these processes work by election and voting rights experts. We know, for example, that Georgia already has some of the strictest ID laws in the nation. We are one of the 7 states that already requires a photo ID to vote in person. We know, too, that our state paid for 3 independent audits to demonstrate the soundness of our election results, and there was 0 evidence of forged signatures. We have heard about the difficulties of obtaining photo identification when you do not have an internet connection or a car or access to a photocopier. In fact, we heard enough about this to convince the Speaker of the House to announce free photo identification across the state. We have talked a lot about facts, but we have spent far less time talking about feelings. And when feelings run deep, many times facts can fall flat. When the mind is closed, so too can be the ears. What I have seen and what I have been told by my Republican colleagues is that this is about people's feelings. Some people feel that our elections are not secure. Many people feel there was fraud and they need to be reassured. But I bet none of you can get up here today and argue that there was widespread fraud in the last election. I too listened to the testimony of people who feel the election wasn't secure. And I have read the emails, because I have plenty of them, claiming there was fraud. But if you listen to what these people are saying, none of them are saying changes in this law will make them feel better. Most of them are still looking for a do-over for the 2020 general election. Many of them are saying things like, we need to go back to just making everyone vote in person on election day. I can't deny there is a problem with how some people feel about the election, but these people believe a lie, and there is no tweak to our election laws that is going to satisfy them. People who are encouraged not to accept election results when they don't like the outcomes are not going to be placated by this bill or any other. So I need to know if there is no factual basis to prove the need for the provisions of this bill, and it's clear that those who feel there was widespread fraud in the last election won't feel any better, then where does that leave us? So if we are going to ignore facts and talk about feelings, then I'm going to talk about my own F word. Freedom. As the first Black woman to serve as a party leader in this body, I appreciate the freedoms that are granted in my life. I am aware of how many freedoms I enjoyed that my ancestors did not. A lot of people have shed a lot of blood so that we could all be in this room together, working on behalf of Georgians today. I don't take that freedom for granted. There is a reason that the activists who fought in many cases died to ensure the rights of Black people to vote were called freedom riders. Because even though Black people and Black women like me had the right to vote for decades, they did not have the freedom to exercise their vote. Rights and freedoms go hand in hand. If you are willing to acknowledge that every citizen has the right to vote, you have to also be willing to grant them the freedom to exercise that vote. We still have not, as a state, managed to guarantee those freedoms. The truth is, we are still, even without this legislation, falling short. There are still many thousands of people in this state who face challenges when voting. Transportation challenges, accessibility challenges, technology challenges, and ID requirement challenges. Even with all we have done to improve conditions, we still saw hours-long waits in our bigger counties during early voting. We had thousands of voters who requested absentee ballots that they never received. These are the problems we should be trying to solve. I know that many of you like to tout our high numbers of registered voters. You will try to wave in my face the high black turnout we have seen in recent years. But those accomplishments are largely not a result, but in spite of Georgia's laws. These strides are the results of relentless organizing and determined voters. As the laws of this nation have evolved to allow more than just the white land-owning male citizens to vote, our election laws have to evolve with them. Absentee voting, early voting, these are provisions that ensure all those who have the right to vote actually have the freedom to exercise that vote. I know some of you think I'm exaggerating. Some of you are asking, what's the big deal? So you have to have an ID. So maybe you have to vote in person. But you're not seeing these changes through the eyes of a person who will struggle to overcome these challenges. Someone who works 2 jobs and lacks a car and a driver's license. Many of these people exist, and they have the right to vote, just the same as you and me. I ask you not to diminish their freedom to exercise that right. If this body chooses feelings over fact, if this body chooses feelings over freedoms, let's not choose the feelings and freedoms